Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Midnight Stories. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be nice if everyone could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Alright, let's get comfy, relax, and begin. We were camping about 90 minutes outside Seattle, just past a small town called Index. It was a quiet stretch of land near a fast-moving river, tucked in among thick pines and mossy rocks. We weren't planning anything elaborate, just a simple overnight to get out of the city, breathe in some clean air, and shut off our phones. The spot we chose was close to the road, but not too close, just far enough that we wouldn't hear cars passing unless they were deliberately slowing down. There wasn't anyone else around, and it felt like we had the woods to ourselves. Right where we pulled off the road, there was an old, rusted-out car half buried in weeds. Looked like it had been sitting there for years. All the windows were shattered, the tires were long gone, and the hood was open like someone had given up fixing it decades ago. The underbrush had started to grow into it. It wasn't threatening or anything, just sort of a strange landmark. A piece of junk no one bothered to tow. We joked that it was a car graveyard and maybe some raccoons had moved in. We parked nearby and carried our gear about 30 yards down toward the river where we found a flat, clear space just big enough for our small tent and a fire ring made from piled stones. The air smelled like pine and river water, cool and clean. That first night was perfect. We built a fire, cooked some instant noodles and hot dogs, and stayed up drinking cheap beer and listening to the water rush over the rocks. There were no bugs to speak of, and the stars came out bright through the gaps in the canopy. Around midnight, we crawled into the tent, sleeping bags already warm from sitting near the fire. In the morning, the light came early. I was the first one up. The tent had filled with that damp kind of air you get near rivers, cool and earthy. My clothes felt a little sticky, and my legs were stiff from the thin sleeping pad. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the gray morning. It was cloudy but dry, and the fire pit still held some warm coals. The river was louder in the quiet of the morning, steady and constant. You could smell the wet dirt, the ash from last night's fire, and the faint metal tang of the camping stove we pulled out to make coffee. We didn't rush. We cooked slowly, lazy from the fresh air and the comfort of not having anything to do. I started roasting a few sausages over the fire with a stick I'd whittled flat at the end, while the water boiled for coffee. The smell of the food was making me hungrier by the second. The sausages hissed and popped as their casings crisped and split. We had just started to eat when we heard the crunch of tires rolling over gravel. At first, it didn't even register. A car pulling up on a nearby road wasn't that strange. But this one slowed way down. The engine rumbled, loud and rough, and we looked up the trail through the trees. There, maybe 30 yards away near where we'd parked, a beat-up red pickup had pulled off the road. The thing looked ancient, with patches of mismatched paint and a long crack running across the windshield. There was a Confederate flag sticker slapped on the back window and some kind of metal hunting rack bolted to the roof. The truck stopped directly in front of the old abandoned car. The driver's door opened and a man leaned halfway out. He was wearing a sleeveless shirt, his arms covered in smudged tattoos and grime. His hair was greasy and flattened under a camouflage hat. He didn't get out fully, just braced himself with one leg inside the cab. Then, with no warning, he raised a black handgun and started firing. The shots echoed across the woods like firecrackers going off in a metal shed. It took a second to even register what was happening. The first few rounds punched into the rusted shell of the car, throwing bits of metal and glass into the weeds. I felt the vibrations more than I heard the last few shots. 6, maybe 10 total. Hard to count when your heart jumps into your throat. The man didn't say a word, just emptied the magazine into that car and slammed his door. The truck spun its tires, throwing gravel in all directions, and roared back onto the road. We stood there frozen, half crouched behind our fire ring, eyes locked on the spot where the truck had disappeared. The ringing in my ears faded slowly. The smell of gunpowder hung faintly in the air. A few birds shrieked and took off from the trees, and then it was just quiet again. No voices, no movement, Just the soft hiss of the fire and the sound of the river moving past. I don't know how long we stood there. Time felt weird for a bit, like I was waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. Just that strange, uneasy silence that settles after something loud and violent. We didn't say anything at first. Just kind of looked at each other, eyebrows raised, like we were both trying to make sure we'd seen the same thing. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a weird dream. Some guy had just pulled up and unloaded a full clip into a wrecked car not 50 feet from us. I turned back toward the fire and the half-cooked sausage still resting on the stone near the flames. I picked it up, turned it over, and put it back in the fire. The heat warmed my hands, and I focused on that. We ate the rest of our breakfast in near silence, glancing back toward the road every so often like we expected the guy to come back. He didn't. We drank our coffee a little faster than usual. My stomach felt tight the whole time, but I made myself finish the food. The air didn't feel as fresh anymore. There was something wrong in it now, like the tension had soaked into the trees. We didn't waste time packing. Everything went into the bags with barely any folding or organizing. The tent came down in minutes. We didn't stop to clean out the fire pit or bury the coals. Just kicked a little dirt over it and made sure nothing was actively burning. As we hiked back up the short path to the car, my eyes kept scanning the trees. Every sound, the crunch of a twig, the whistle of wind through the branches, made me tense up. I kept imagining that red truck parked just around the next bend, waiting, but the road was empty. We loaded the gear quickly, barely speaking. The rusted car sat quiet and wrecked, more broken now than it had been before. Holes punched through the doors and hood, blackened edges where the metal had curled from the heat of the bullets. It looked worse, somehow more real, like a body after a second beating. I don't know why he shot it. Maybe he'd been drinking. Maybe it meant something to him. Or maybe it didn't mean anything at all. That's what stuck with me. The randomness of it. The violence so close to us, completely out of our control. We drove away without looking back. The first few miles were tense. I kept checking the rearview mirror, waiting to see headlights flying up behind us. But nothing ever did. After a while, the road smoothed out, the forest thinned, and the edges of civilization started to reappear. Mailboxes, fences, small houses with kids' bikes on the porch. It wasn't until we reached the highway that I let myself breathe normally again. We didn't say much on the ride back. Just let the radio play quietly as the city slowly took shape around us. That trip stuck with me more than most. Not because anything happened to us directly, but because it reminded me how fast things can shift. How one person, one moment, can change the whole feeling of a place. I've gone camping a dozen times since, in places more remote than that one. But I always remember the sound of those gunshots, the way they rang out across the trees like a warning, and the way the fire crackled quietly after they stopped. We've been backpacking for 3 days through Rocky Mountain National Park, somewhere outside of Estes Park, just me and two of my oldest friends from college. The kind of trip where we didn't set alarms, didn't bring much tech, and barely had service to check in with anyone back home. It was midsummer, mid-July I think, and the air up there was thick with mosquitoes, especially the last day. The first 2 nights had been easy. Wide trails, crisp weather, amazing views. Elk grazing near camp, marmots screaming from the rocks, the kind of thing you come out here hoping to see. We had a map, loosely followed it, and picked a more remote site for our third and final night. The path followed a narrow river upstream, winding past a few established campsites. We saw a group of 2 setting up their gear a couple miles in. After them, the trail just kept climbing, brush getting denser and the noise of the river louder. Our site sat right where the marsh started to spill into the riverbanks, tucked against a small stand of trees. The water widened into a slow, green-brown curve, insects dancing over it in swarms, with lily pads forming quiet eddies at the bends. The mosquitoes were brutal, so we threw on long sleeves and head nets. We set up camp early, pitched our tents, filtered some water, made lunch, and then packed light to head farther up the trail. None of us were ready to just sit around in the tent, swatting bugs and waiting for night. We figured the deeper we went into the backcountry, the the better the wildlife sightings. That's when things started to feel strange. The trail kept going uphill, narrowing and roughening until it spit us into an area that looked like it had burned not long ago. A wildfire, probably from the previous year. The trees were black and skeletal, all twisted into each other, their bark cracked and falling off in big curled chunks. The ground was soft with ash in some spots, crusted with dried mud in others. Still, despite the damage, the place was full of life. We saw a pair of mule deer bolt up a ridge as we approached. Birds flitted through the branches. Something howled or yipped across the river. Couldn't tell if it was a fox or coyote. Then about an hour in, we saw a moose. It stood on the far bank of the river, half hidden in smoke-colored willows. At first, we thought it might be dead, the way it stood so still. Its ribs jutted out like broken rungs of a ladder. Its fur hung in patches, thick and greasy. When it turned its head, one eye looked pale and sunken, almost like it was blind on that side. The thing stared at us for a long time, completely still, like it was sizing us up. None of us spoke. When it finally moved, it did so slowly, stiff-legged, and lumbered into the trees like it had all the time in the world. I'll never forget how quiet everything felt after that. We didn't say much walking back. That whole stretch of trail, through those burned trees and silent woods, felt off. Not haunted or cursed or anything like that, just wrong. Like nature was rebuilding itself, but in a way that didn't want us there. By the time we got back to camp, dusk was already crawling in. We made a small fire, boiled some food, then packed it all away properly and tied the bear bag high in a tree about 30 yards off. Even with bug spray and layers, we kept slapping at our necks and arms. I crawled in my tent early, still thinking about the moose, still a little on edge. That night, I put my knife under my pillow, which I almost never do. Not because I expected anything, just, I don't know, something about the day stuck with me. I woke up maybe around 2 or 3 a.m. It was cold, colder than it had been the last 2 nights, and I could hear something moving just outside. Snuffling, sniffing, wet breathing, then a thud, then another. I held my breath, straining my ears, heart thumping hard. Then I heard one of my friends, barely above a whisper, "Bear, bear, bear." I didn't even think. I grabbed the knife and unzipped the tent so fast the whole thing shook. I rolled out into the cold dirt in my underwear, knife in hand, and started yelling. Not words, not anything smart, just a deep, guttural Gaia, go, get. My voice cracked. I stomped toward it like some half-crazed idiot. The bear, smallish, probably a young black bear, looked up, startled. Then it turned and just trotted off into the trees, back the way we'd come, toward the other campsites. I stood there panting, skin crawling, knife still raised. Then I remembered the family we saw earlier, the ones with the 2 small kids, setting up a few hours before us. My stomach dropped. I didn't think, didn't even throw pants on. I just bolted after the bear. I must have looked insane. Barefoot, running down a dirt trail in boxer briefs, brandishing a 10-inch fixed-blade camping knife and shouting. I didn't even see the bear anymore. I was running on panic, pure and stupid. I came barreling into their camp, yelling, trying to explain about the bear. I think I said, "Bear's coming this way," or something like that, but it was dark and I was shaking and I probably looked like some crazed hill person out of a horror movie. The dad shot up, blinking, shirtless and barefoot, and just stood there frozen, like every warning he'd ever read was happening at once. The mom grabbed both kids and started dragging them down the trail in her sleeping clothes, moving fast and not looking back. I chased after her, again with the knife, trying to say, "Wait." No, I'm not trying to, but I quickly realized I was making things worse. Eventually, I stopped, stood there in the middle of the trail, chest heaving, freezing, starting to feel like the world's biggest idiot. I called back to my friends and told them what happened. I don't even know how long it took to settle everything. I ended up walking the family back to their site, after putting on clothes and ditching the knife. I tried explaining again, told them about the bear, told them I just panicked, told them I wasn't a threat. They were polite enough, but I could tell. They weren't afraid of the bear anymore. They were afraid of me. The dad stayed up the rest of the night, sitting by the fire with a headlamp on and a hatchet in his lap. I went back to our camp, tail between my legs. My friends didn't stop laughing the whole next day. Knife guy, they started calling me. Crazy underwear survivalist. I deserved it. We hiked out the next morning in silence for a while, until someone said, "At least the bear didn't maul anyone." I got a few tired chuckles. I didn't see the family again. Their car was already gone by the time we reached the trailhead. Every now and then I think about it. Not the bear, not the moose, not even the burned forest. I think about what that dad must have felt, seeing some stranger charging into his campsite in the middle of the night, waving a knife in his underwear. I think about how that story probably gets told around their dinner table now, about the crazy guy in the woods. And I think about how, somewhere out there, I might be the villain in someone else's campfire story. The thing they joke about, but also maybe half believe. I don't blame them. I probably would have done the same. But next time, I'm bringing bear spray and pants. When I was about 12, we went camping in this weird, dry part of Western Australia, Hamelin Pool, near the stromatolites. I remember the name because Dad kept going on about how old they were, billions of years or something. At that age, I didn't really care. All I knew was that we were going to be spending a few days in this remote place. Just us, me, my parents, and my two younger brothers. We pulled into what was supposed to be a caravan park, but it wasn't what any of us expected. It was basically an old sports oval that someone had decided to turn into a campground. There were no trees, no real spots set up for camping, just a flat, open patch of dry, sun-baked dirt with a few patches of grass that looked more dead than alive. There was a single gazebo in the middle of the whole thing, one of those metal-roofed ones with a concrete slab and a couple of faded picnic benches underneath. No other cars, no other tents, no sign of life at all. The office building looked abandoned, even though there was a dusty sign hanging out front with faded letters that said Hamelin Camping and Caravan Ground. Dad said he'd already paid online, so we just set up near the edge of the oval, away from the gazebo, thinking maybe we'd get a bit of privacy even though nobody else was around. The heat during the day was unbearable, the kind of dry heat that makes your skin feel like it's cracking open. We tried to keep the tent closed to avoid flies and dust, but it turned into an oven inside. There was no shade except for the gazebo, so we ended up sitting there most of the day, drinking warm water and swatting away bugs. My brothers, who were maybe 9 and 7, kept complaining they were bored, and honestly, I was too. The place just fell off from the beginning. Too quiet. No birds, no wind, just this stillness that made everything feel unnatural. Even the few trees we could see far off in the distance looked dry and dead. When night came, the air cooled quickly. We cooked up something simple, sausages and baked beans on the little camp stove, and then all crawled into the tent early because there wasn't much else to do. No signal, no light except the stars and our lantern, and no noise except the distant sound of insects. The sort of camping night where you expect to sleep soundly just because there's nothing else going on. I must have fallen asleep quickly because I don't remember lying there long. But something woke me up. Not a sound, not at first, more like a feeling. The kind of alertness you get when your body just knows something isn't right. I opened my eyes and saw the dim green glow of the lantern we had left on at the far side of the tent. I could see the outlines of my brothers beside me, curled up in their sleeping bags. Then I noticed my mom and dad sitting up, both very still. There was a sound outside, very soft footsteps, fast, but not heavy, light like someone barefoot or wearing socks. It circled the tent once, slowly, and then again a little quicker. I could see the shadow of someone through the nylon wall of the tent as they passed by the lantern's light. It wasn't a sharp silhouette, just the vaguest movement, like a shadow flicking by. The footsteps weren't loud enough to tell if it was one person or more. No twig snapping, just that faint sound, grit and dust on her feet, moving around us in slow loops. Mom whispered something barely audible. Then Dad slowly reached for the torch near the flap, but he didn't open it. He just sat there frozen, listening. I could tell by his face that he was trying to figure out what to do. He was usually calm about this kind of stuff. Logical, but even in the dim light, I could see his jaw was clenched. That scared me more than the footsteps. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again. Faster, a full lap around the tent. Then silence. Then again, faster, like whoever it was running around us. Still light, still soft, but fast enough that the fabric of the tent fluttered slightly with each pass. I wanted to say something, but couldn't move. My brothers were both awake now, both sitting up, eyes wide, not saying a word. No one moved. No one even breathed loud. It was like all five of us were stuck in this frozen panic, just listening. Then it stopped completely. Not like it faded away, just stopped. Like whoever or whatever was doing it had just dropped to the ground or vanished. There were no more footsteps, no wind, no sound of someone walking away. Just dead silence. We all sat there for what felt like forever. Dad finally turned off the lantern. We didn't say anything. We just lay back down, all of us still in our clothes, and stared at the ceiling of the tent. I don't know how long I was awake after that. Could have been hours. But at some point, I must have drifted off again. We were all up as soon as the sun came up. No one really said anything. Dad just started packing everything up. Not even breakfast. Just rolling up the sleeping bags, tearing down the tent, tossing everything in the back of the car. Mom helped quietly. My brothers didn't complain. They just did what they were told, which wasn't like them at all. The mood was heavy. Everyone was tense and tired, like we'd all been through something we didn't understand. Before we left, I walked over to the gazebo while Dad was tying down the last of the gear. I don't even know why. Curiosity, I guess. There was a weird smell in the air like rust and sweat. I walked up to one of the benches and saw a plastic bottle lying on its side. It had some kind of murky liquid inside and no label. Nearby, there were 2 cigarette butts on the concrete, fresh enough that they hadn't been blown away or covered in dust like everything else, and a single, narrow footprint in the dry dirt near the edge of the slab. No shoes, just the imprint of toes and a heel. Barefoot, I walked back to the car without saying anything. Dad looked at me and nodded. We drove out of there without looking back. Didn't even stop at the stromatolites. I think we were all just done. I've been camping a lot since then, all over Australia, in forests, deserts, beaches. Most places feel fine. Even remote bushland with no reception and no one around doesn't bother me. But that place, whatever it was about it, felt wrong from the start. It didn't feel like somewhere people were supposed to stay. And to this day, I don't know who or what was running around our tent that night. But I know what I heard, and I know I never want to go back. My girlfriend and I had planned the trip for months. We found this little A-frame cabin on a rental site tucked away in northern Minnesota, right by a frozen lake. It looked perfect, remote, quiet, surrounded by thick pine forest. The picture showed that one entire side of the cabin, facing the lake, was floor-to-ceiling windows. During the day, sunlight poured in and made the whole place feel warm and open. At night, though, that wall of glass turned into a black mirror. The cabin was small, just one room with a loft bed up a ladder, a wood-burning stove, and a tiny kitchenette. The bathroom was an outhouse down a short path, and there was no cell signal unless we hiked up the ridge behind the property. We brought enough food for 3 nights, a few books, and a deck of cards. The plan was to disconnect for a few days, relax, cook simple meals, and enjoy the snow. It was early January, cold but not bitter, highs in the 20s. The snow had a crust to it, hard-packed and undisturbed. The first night went smoothly. We made soup, played cards, and sat by the fire. The woods outside were silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. It was almost too quiet. The fire crackled, and the glass windows reflected the flickering light back at us. At one point, I stepped outside to use the outhouse and stood for a moment on the porch. The snow stretched out in every direction, unbroken and smooth. The lake was just beyond the trees, flat and white. Not a single footprint anywhere. It felt like we were the only 2 people on Earth. The second night started the same. We cooked pasta, opened a bottle of wine, and sat by the fire again. My girlfriend climbed up into the loft with her book, and I stayed below, poking at the logs, feeding him more wood. That's when I first heard it. A soft noise behind me, right against the window. Screech, screech. It was faint, just enough to catch my ear. I turned around, expecting maybe a squirrel or a branch tapping the glass. Nothing, just the dark reflection of the room behind me. and beyond that, total blackness. I sat back down, thinking it was just the stove crackling or maybe ice shifting outside. Then I heard it again. Screech, screech, screech. Louder this time, more insistent. It sounded like something dragging against the glass. Sharp, deliberate. I stood up, grabbed the flashlight off the shelf, and walked over to the front windows. I pressed my face close, trying to see beyond the reflection. Nothing. I turned on the porch light and stepped outside, boots crunching on the snow. The air was cold and still. I shone the flashlight around the edges of the cabin, down toward the base of the windows, then higher. There were no footprints anywhere. No broken branches, no sign of any animal. I checked again, sweeping the light side to side, trying to find some shape or movement. But there was absolutely nothing out there. I stayed out for a few more minutes, listening. The only sound was the low creaking of trees in the distance and the faint ticking of the cooling metal stove behind me. Eventually, I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I told myself it was a raccoon or a porcupine, maybe even a bird, just something passing through. I went up to the loft and lay beside my girlfriend. She was asleep already. I kept listening, ears tuned to every pop and creak of the cabin settling. But the noise didn't come back. I drifted off eventually, more uneasy than I wanted to admit. The next morning, I stepped outside to get some firewood. The air had warmed slightly, and the snow had a layer of crust that cracked under my boots. As I passed in front of the windows, I stopped. There were 5 long scratches across the center pane of glass. Not cracks, scratches. Thin, deliberate lines etched right into the surface. They started high up, well above waist level, and slanted downward at an angle, unevenly spaced like a hand with fingers splayed. I stared at them for a long time. There was no way an animal did that. They were too precise, too high off the ground. I walked around the cabin again, scanning the snow. Still no footprints. Not human, not animal. Just smooth, unbroken snow all the way to the trees. I even walked back and forth a few times just to be sure I wasn't missing anything. The scratches were fresh, no doubt about it. I didn't say anything right away. I just stood there for a while, thinking it through. The porch was clear. The roof sloped sharply, so nothing would have fallen from above. The woodpile was untouched. No signs of anything nearby. Eventually, I went back inside, made coffee, and waited for my girlfriend to wake up. When she did, I told her what I found. We didn't talk much after that. There wasn't anything to say. We both felt it. Something was wrong. We were supposed to stay one more night, but we decided to leave early. We packed in silence, moving quickly, trying not to look at the windows too much. I kept feeling like something might be just out of view, standing behind the tree line, watching. But every time I looked, the woods were still. Right before we left, I walked down the porch steps one last time and looked out toward the trees. That's when I saw it. There was a tree about 30 feet from the cabin, off to the left. An old pine with rough bark. Carved into the trunk, facing directly toward the window wall, were 4 words. "You see me now." The letters were jagged and deep, cut with something sharp. The bark around them was fresh, still curling at the edges. It hadn't been there before. Not when we arrived. Not yesterday morning. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't go any closer. We got in the car and left. We didn't stop until we hit the highway. The cabin's owner messaged me a day later asking why we left early. I didn't respond. We didn't post a review. We didn't tell our friends. We just didn't want to think about it. A few weeks later, I looked up the listing again. It was gone, completely taken down. The pictures were removed, the location erased, like it had never existed. I still think about those scratches sometimes, about how high they were, about the fact that there were no tracks in the snow. And I think about that message carved into the tree, because whoever or whatever did that, they were standing just outside those windows, close enough to touch the glass, watching us all night. We never went back. It was early July when we planned a camping trip out to Wells Gray Provincial Park near Clearwater, British Columbia. We've been talking about it for months, needing a proper break from work, phones, noise, everything. It was just me and 2 friends. We'd rented a small cabin not far from Clearwater Lake. tucked deep enough into the woods that we wouldn't see anyone unless we wanted to. No cell service, just nature. The kind of quiet where the loudest sound was your boots on gravel or the crackle of the fire at night. Perfect, we thought. We got there late in the afternoon on a Friday. The cabin was simple, a single room with bunks, a wood stove, and a few shelves for food. No electricity, no running water. Just an outhouse about 20 feet into the trees. We spent that evening gathering firewood, setting up the lanterns, unpacking gear. The sun set slow and deep orange, and the whole forest fell quiet except for the occasional distant owl or the rustling of something small moving through underbrush. There was always something moving, but it never felt threatening. Just the usual wilderness stuff. That first night, we made dinner over the fire, canned chili, some sausages, a few beers to wash it all down. We sat up late, just watching the flames. It's amazing how long you can sit around a fire without talking, just listening and thinking. Around midnight, the air turned cold, even for summer, so we finally crawled into our sleeping bags in the cabin. I remember falling asleep to the sound of wind brushing through the tall pines outside. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up to lights flashing through the cracks in the cabin walls. Not firelight, flashlights, headlamps, white and sharp, moving. I sat up slowly, confused, my mind still stuck halfway in a dream. Then I heard boots, heavy boots, more than one pair, crunching gravel outside. The front door creaked, then a knock, firm, repeated. I looked at my friends. One of them was already sitting up, the other was still trying to wake up. We opened the door and were hit with beams of light. I squinted. There were at least 3 men standing there. RCMP, uniforms. One of them had a rifle slung over his shoulder, the others had sidearms. Behind them, a police truck idled quietly with its lights spinning, and a second vehicle was parked not far off with 2 German shepherds pacing and barking inside. They told us to come outside. No real explanations yet, just orders. Come out of the cabin, slowly, all 3 of you. We stepped out into the cold, early morning air. It was still dark, not even a hint of sun. The smell of pine and cold earth hit me. The gravel felt like ice under my socks. They lined us up along the side of the cabin. One of the officers stood facing us while the other 2 moved toward the vehicles. That's when I saw the dogs again, now out and straining against their leashes, already barking. Then one of the cops said something that locked everything in place. There's been an escape. Local holding facility. Inmate missing. Dogs picked up a trail heading this way. That's all he said, but it was enough. My mouth felt dry. My stomach sank. We were just out here trying to disconnect, and now we were in the middle of some manhunt. The dogs came forward, handlers keeping them close. They sniffed the ground hard, circled, barked again, then moved toward us. One of the officers brought over a sealed plastic bag. Inside was a ragged piece of fabric. Looked like a shirt or jacket. Dark blue. Dirty. They held it out for the dogs. One of the dogs lunged at it, pulling hard on the leash, whining like it wanted to go. The next few minutes were a blur. The dogs were walked up to us, one by one. They sniffed each of us, shoes, pant legs, backpacks that had been tossed outside. They moved fast, trained, methodical. You could tell they'd done this before. One of the dogs barked sharply and turned toward the woods behind the cabin. The handler pointed and the other officer nodded. We were told to grab our gear and prepare to evacuate. It wasn't a request. They said it fast, like they'd said it 100 times before. Grab essentials. Leave food if you have to. We're escorting you out. No one argued. We shoved everything back into our bags as fast as we could. I left my toothbrush behind. Didn't even think about it. We just wanted to get out. There was this pressure in the air now, like the forest was holding its breath. Like we weren't supposed to be here anymore. The police drove us out in a convoy. It was still dark. The headlights lit up nothing but trees and fog as we bumped down that narrow gravel road for what felt like forever. I kept looking out the back window, half expecting to see someone running after us in the shadows. Nothing ever came, but my nerves didn't settle. When we got to the main road, they let us out at a gas station. There were already other campers and hikers being dropped off there too. Everyone looked the same, tired, confused, tense. Some had come from further up the park, others from lakeside spots. It wasn't just our cabin. They were clearing out a huge area. We stood there in the early light, watching the fog lift off the highway. There was a kind of heaviness in the silence between people, like no one really knew what to say. Eventually, we got in the car and started the long drive back to Kamloops. No music, just the sound of tires on asphalt and the occasional radio update. By late afternoon, we got word through the news. The man had been caught. The dogs found him not far from where we'd been staying, less than a kilometer downhill from the cabin. He'd apparently tried to sleep under some rocks, half covered in moss and branches. He must have been freezing. No gear, just a torn-up uniform and shoes that looked too small for him. When they found him, he tried to run, but didn't get far. The dogs caught up quick. They didn't release many details, but one of the articles said something about minor injuries during apprehension. We all knew what that meant. The dogs got to him before the officers did. I didn't feel bad. That night back home, I kept thinking about how close he'd been. We'd been sitting by the fire, laughing and drinking, completely unaware. He might have even watched us. He might have passed through camp while we were sleeping. Could have been just feet away. We canceled the rest of the trip. Didn't even think about going back. The thought of being out in the woods, isolated, knowing that someone desperate and dangerous could just appear out of nowhere. No thanks. It wasn't the wilderness I was scared of. Not bears or storms or getting lost. It was people. People hiding where they don't belong. We all slept with our phones beside our pillows for a few weeks after that. I locked my doors twice every night, sometimes 3 times, even though we lived in a quiet neighborhood. Something about that trip stuck. The randomness of it, the closeness of it, how things can go from peaceful to dangerous in an instant with no warning. I still go camping sometimes, but never without checking local alerts. Never without service or satellite phone. And never, ever near any place with a jail. I booked a small Airbnb in a quiet neighborhood while I visited family for a few days. It was nothing fancy, just a simple, single-story place tucked between 2 other houses with well-kept lawns and the kind of trimmed hedges that made the whole area feel peaceful. The listing had decent reviews and the photos looked clean, so I didn't overthink it. I just needed somewhere private to sleep at night since I didn't want to bother my relatives too much with my late comings and goings. I checked in early in the afternoon. The sun was still high, casting sharp shadows along the sidewalk. The lockbox worked fine. I stepped in and did what I always do, drop my bag by the couch, kick off my shoes, and slowly walk through the place to get a feel for it. The layout was pretty straightforward. Living room straight ahead, kitchen off to the left, and a narrow hallway leading down to the bathroom and bedroom. There was a linen closet in the hallway, a narrow door next to a framed print of a mountain lake. Everything seemed neat and tidy. The floors creaked a little when I walked, and the appliances looked like they were from the early 2000s, but nothing stood out as a problem. The couch smelled faintly like someone had cleaned it with a lemony spray. There was even a welcome note left on the table and a small bottle of water in the fridge, which I appreciated. I figured I'd gotten a good deal. It was only after an hour or 2 that I noticed a strange smell in the hallway. At first, I assumed it was just the way older homes sometimes smell, like dust mixed with wood or maybe a bit of mildew from the air conditioner. But this was different. It was sour, like old milk left in a hot car. Subtle, but unpleasant. I figured maybe the trash hadn't been taken out properly by the last guest, so I checked the bin under the sink. It was empty and lined with a fresh bag. Then I checked the bathroom. No sign of anything odd in there either. I opened all the windows I could. The front ones didn't open much, but I got a few cracked wide enough to let some fresh air in. I left the bedroom door open to let the air circulate and went about unpacking. Still, every time I passed the hallway, I caught that faint but sickly smell again. It didn't seem to be getting worse, but it wasn't going away either. I crouched near the floor to see if maybe something had leaked under the baseboards. Nothing visible. I even stuck my head into the linen closet, thinking maybe some damn towels had been left in there too long. But all I saw were neatly folded sheets, a couple of white bath towels, and a small box of tissues on the bottom shelf. I pulled a few things out, checked behind them, and didn't see anything unusual. It wasn't strong enough to justify calling the host yet, so I figured I'd deal with it in the morning if it was still lingering. That night, the smell got worse. It wasn't just noticeable anymore. It hit me every time I walked down the hall. I could feel it in my nose, like it clung to my nostrils. I lit a candle I had in my bag just to make it bearable. When I lay in bed trying to sleep, the smell seemed to creep under the door, as if it were slowly filling the house. I got up twice just to check if I'd missed something obvious. I ran the bathroom fan for a while. I even wiped down the shelves in the linen closet with a damp cloth. Still nothing helped. It started to bother me more than it probably should have, but something about it made my skin crawl. Not just the smell itself, but the fact that I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. I ended up dozing off sometime around 3 in the morning, but it wasn't restful. I kept waking up every hour, eyes stinging, mouth dry, trying to ignore the headache that was forming from the smell. The next morning, as soon as I got out of bed, I decided I needed to find the source once and for all. I started with the linen closet again, pulling everything out this time. Every towel, every blanket, even the tissue box. When I removed the bottom shelf completely, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a vent cover low on the back wall, right near the floor. It was almost hidden behind a shelf frame. The metal slats looked dark, stained at the edges, and there was a faint crust around the screws like old moisture or rust. I leaned in closer. The sour smell hit me like a slap. It was definitely coming from there. I didn't have any tools, but I went to the kitchen and found a butter knife. It barely fit into the screw heads, but after a few minutes of slow, careful work, I managed to loosen them. The vent cover creaked as I pulled it off. I held it in one hand and turned on the flashlight on my phone. Then I crouched and aimed the light into the dark space behind the wall. What I saw made my stomach lurch. Lying just inside, curled up and wedged awkwardly behind the drywall and ductwork, was a dead opossum. Not small, fully grown. Its fur was matted and dirty, its limbs twisted like it had gotten stuck while trying to escape. The skin had pulled tight around its face, and I could see the teeth. It was bloated in places and sunken in others, and the smell was overwhelming now that the vent was open. My stomach turned, and I barely kept myself from vomiting right there. I dropped the vent cover and slammed the closet door shut like that would make a difference. I ran to the bathroom, washed my hands, splashed water on my face, and just stood there breathing through my mouth. My eyes watered. The more I thought about it, the more I couldn't believe how close that thing had been all night, slowly rotting just a few feet from where I was sleeping. I messaged the host. I didn't want to touch it again or even go near that hallway. I wrote that there was a dead animal behind the wall and that the smell was unbearable. I didn't even wait for a full response before I started packing my things. I couldn't stay there another night. I took one last look to make sure I hadn't left anything, grabbed my bag, and walked out. I sat in my car with the windows down for a long while before I could even start driving. I felt like the smell had clung to my clothes, to my skin. Eventually, the host replied, apologizing. She said something along the lines of, "That happens sometimes. I thought we sealed that part off." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I sent a refund request through Airbnb, attached the photos I'd taken of the vent and the dead opossum. Within a few hours, they approved it. I ended up staying with my cousin for the rest of the trip, slept on his couch, and dealt with the mild awkwardness of being a last-minute guest. But I didn't care. At least his place didn't smell like death. I couldn't get that image out of my head for days. The way the animal looked twisted and forgotten, the way the sour stench had slowly built up, unnoticed. Since then, every time I check into a new place, Airbnb, hotel, guest room, I do the same thing. I walk through the room slowly, I open the closets, and most of all, I sniff the air. It sounds strange, maybe obsessive, but I can't help it. There's something about a smell like that. Once you've smelled it, once you've lived near it for even one night, it never leaves you. It's like a warning your body remembers, and I'll never ignore that warning again. I rented a 2-bedroom Airbnb for a weekend trip with my sister. She couldn't get the Friday off work, so I got there a day earlier. It was in a quiet neighborhood just outside a small town. Nothing remote, but far enough from the city to feel like a break. The unit was part of a duplex, single story, with a driveway and a little patch of lawn. It looked normal, maybe a little older than the pictures, but clean. The host had left the key in a lockbox by the front door and messaged me the code earlier in the day. When I walked in, it smelled like lemon cleaner. The lights were all off except for one in the kitchen. The place had a worn-in feel. Beige carpet, a slightly lumpy couch, a flat-screen TV mounted too high on the wall. A couple framed photos of what looked like random countryside scenes. Nothing fancy, but nothing sketchy either. I dropped my bag in the larger of the two bedrooms and took a quick walk around. The second bedroom had twin beds and a little desk. There was one bathroom, stocked with basic toiletries. Everything seemed fine. I made myself some tea, watched a little YouTube on my phone, then locked up and went to bed around 10:30. I kept the bedroom door open. I don't know why. Maybe because I was alone and wanted to hear if anything was going on in the rest of the house. I set my phone to do not disturb, but kept it face up on the nightstand. The hallway light spilled into the room from under the doorframe. I was just starting to fall asleep when I heard it, a knock at the front door. Not a hard knock, just 3 slow, spaced out taps. I froze. For a second, I thought I imagined it. I sat up and waited. 10 seconds later, 3 more knocks. Same rhythm. I got up quietly and moved toward the front of the house. The knocks didn't come again, but I kept hearing a faint shuffling noise. I looked through the peephole. A man was standing there, late 30s maybe. He had a suitcase in one hand and a phone in the other. He wasn't doing anything threatening, just standing there, glancing down his phone, then back up at the door. I didn't open it. My heart was racing. I backed away from the door and crouched behind the wall so he couldn't see any movement through the windows. Then I heard his voice. "Hey," he said, loud enough to carry through the door. "I'm the other guest." The host double-booked. "Can I come in?" No way. I wasn't even going to respond. I unlocked my phone and went straight to the Airbnb app, opened the message thread with the host, and typed. Asterisk, someone's at the door. Says he's the other guest. Claims you double-booked. Asterisk. She replied within 30 seconds. Asterisk. No one else is supposed to be there. Don't open the door. Asterisk. I felt my stomach drop. The man was still outside. I didn't know if he could see movement through the peephole from his side, so I stayed low. After a minute or so of silence, he knocked again, then again. Still 3 knocks each time. Not angry, just steady. I watched the shadows under the door. He wasn't pacing or walking around. He was just standing there. It was like he expected me to eventually cave in and open up. I glanced at the clock. It was just past 11. He stood there for almost 20 minutes. Every now and then I'd hear him shift or clear his throat. But he didn't knock again. At one point, he walked a little off to the side. I saw his silhouette cross in front of the window, but he came right back to the door. Then just like that, he left. I peeked through the peephole again, and he was gone. I waited a few more minutes before creeping to the front window and pulling the curtain back an inch. He was walking down the street with his suitcase rolling behind him. Not running, not looking back, just casually strolling away, like he was heading home from the grocery store. I locked everything again, even though I already had. I pushed the heavy armchair in front of the front door, then grabbed the largest kitchen knife I could find and brought it with me to the bedroom. I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining that he had circled around and was hiding in the backyard, or that he'd figure out how to open one of the windows. Every small sound made me jump. The fridge kicked on at one point, and I thought someone was moving in the hallway. My heart was in my throat for half the night. Around 3 a.m., I started to feel a little stupid for being so scared, but I stayed up anyway. By morning, I hadn't slept more than maybe 40 minutes in total. When the sun came up, I messaged the host again and told her he was gone, but I wanted to know what the hell had happened. She apologized again and sent me a screenshot of a message she'd received late the previous night. It was from a brand new Airbnb account. No reviews, no name. Just a username like guest194837. The message said, asterisk, "Hey, I forgot the exact address of the Airbnb. Can you send it again?" Asterisk. She hadn't replied. She told me she always refuses to give out the address directly to anyone unless they're booked through the app. She checked her settings and confirmed that no one else had access to the place. No double booking, no mix-up. Just someone who had somehow found the listing, maybe grabbed screenshots when it was still public, and tried to show up pretending to be a guest. Airbnb customer support got involved. I had to write a detailed report. The host told them everything too. By that afternoon, the listing had been switched to private. She said she was going to install a security camera and change the locks, just in case. When my sister arrived later that day, I didn't tell her the full story until we were driving back home 2 days later. I didn't want to freak her out while we were still staying there. We didn't have any more issues the rest of the weekend, but I couldn't fully relax. I kept checking the peephole every couple hours and slept with that same knife next to the bed. I don't know how he got the address. Maybe he recognized something in the photos, like a street sign, a business in the background, something small I didn't notice. Maybe he'd stayed in the same area before and guessed. Maybe he had a more sophisticated way of finding it. I'll never know. What still gets to me is how calm he was. No shouting, no banging, no trying to break in. He looked like a real guest. Acted like one. Like he really thought he could talk his way in. Like maybe it had worked before. I still use Airbnb, but now I only rent places with doorbell cameras and multiple verified reviews. I also make sure never to arrive alone if I can help it. That night made it clear. Sometimes it's not the place that's dangerous. It's the people who try to get in. I rented a mountain cabin for a solo riding retreat, thinking a few days away from people would help me focus. The place was way up in the hills, about an hour's drive from town, then another few miles on a winding dirt road. No neighbors, no cell service, just woods quiet and time. It was a small one-bedroom cabin with a wraparound porch and a steep roof, tucked into the trees like something out of a postcard. Inside, it was clean and rustic. Wood walls, old leather furniture, a stone fireplace. There was a small kitchen, a bathroom with a tankless heater, and a queen-sized bed pushed against one corner of the single bedroom. A narrow crawlspace hatch was located outside on the side, facing away from the driveway. The first night was quiet. I made some pasta, poured a glass of wine, and sat out on the porch for a while listening to the breeze roll through the pines. After sunset, it got cold fast. I moved inside, lit a fire in the fireplace, and read a few pages from a book before heading to bed. The mattress was firmer than I liked, but the stillness made up for it. No cars, no sirens, no city noise. I drifted off quick. The second night is when things got strange. I had spent most of the day riding and hiking. By late evening, I was beat. I cooked a quick dinner and got into bed early. Around midnight, I woke up, not to a loud sound, but something quiet, just enough to pull me out of sleep. I stayed still, eyes open in the dark, listening. There was again, a soft, dull thud, then another, and another, slow, rhythmic, like someone knocking softly, but not at the door or on the walls. It was coming from beneath me, right under the floor, under the bed. I sat up, trying to stay calm. The sound stopped. I got out of bed and turned on the lights, walked slowly around the cabin. Nothing. I even stepped out onto the porch, flashlight in hand. The night was dead still. No wind, no animals, just cold air and trees. I circled the cabin, eventually making my way to the side with the crawlspace hatch. It had a rusty metal latch, and I checked it. Still locked, stiff. I even brushed some leaves and pine needles away from the edge. No signs anyone had been near it. No footprints in the dirt. Figuring maybe it was the cabin settling or some animal, I went back inside and tried to sleep. I couldn't. I laid awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Just before dawn, I finally dozed off for an hour or two. The next day, I tried to push the sound out of my mind. I went for a long hike, tried to keep my thoughts on writing. I didn't want to spook myself over nothing. But that night, the sound came back. Louder this time, more defined. Knock, knock, knock. Always in threes, and always from directly under the bed. I sat up fast, listened. The sound didn't stop. Knock, knock, knock. I got out of bed and pressed my ear to the floor. It sounded like it was just beneath the boards, not something hitting the outside foundation. Something under the floor, inside the crawl space. I grabbed the flashlight again and stepped outside. It was colder than the night before. Frost on the grass. I walked around to the hatch and checked it. Still locked. Still undisturbed. No signs of tampering. I squatted and pressed my ear near the wood of the hatch. Nothing. No sound. I stood there for a long minute. then went back inside and tried to sleep on the couch instead. I wrapped myself in a blanket and tried to calm down. At 3 a.m., I heard it again. Knock, 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 from directly below the couch. That was enough. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept every light on and just sat there, listening, waiting. I didn't hear the knocking again, but I kept thinking about the crawl space. I didn't want to open it myself. I didn't want to know what was down there alone in the dark. By the time the sun came up, I'd already made up my mind. I called the property manager. I drove 10 minutes down the hill until I got a single bar of signal and called the number listed in the cabin binder. The woman on the other end answered groggily. I told her what was happening, just the basics. No guesses, no wild theories, just a knocking. She told me she'd come up to check it out, said she'd bring a flashlight and tools. She sounded skeptical but polite. She showed up an hour later in an old Subaru. Middle-aged, worn boots, heavy coat. Introduced herself, but didn't chat much. I led her around to the side of the cabin and pointed at the crawl space hatch. She bent down, unlatched it and pulled it open. Then she froze. I stood behind her, watching the beam of her flashlight cut through the dark gap. She didn't move for a good 15 seconds. Then she spoke quietly. Someone's been down there. She climbed halfway into the crawl space, then came back out slowly, holding a few things in her gloved hands. A dirty fleece blanket, crumpled fast food wrappers, a used water bottle, and a flip phone, one of those old prepaid kinds. Dusty, but the screen lit up when she tapped the button. She didn't say much else, just told me to go inside. She made a call from her car, speaking quietly. Later, 2 sheriff's deputies came up. They ducked into the crawl space, stayed under there a while, and came out with more trash. A stained pillow, a plastic bag filled with empty cans, and what looked like a piece of rope. Nothing that screamed violence, but it was clear someone had been living down there. For how long? No one knew. The hatch was locked from the outside. There were no signs of forced entry. And yet somehow, someone had gotten in. Maybe before it was locked. Maybe while someone was supposed to be doing maintenance and never noticed. The crawl space wasn't deep, maybe 3 feet high, and there was no access from inside the cabin. But someone had definitely been staying there, eating, sleeping, and knocking. The flip phone had a few recent outgoing calls, but they were to numbers that went nowhere. Burners, dead ends. The police ran what they could. No ID, no fingerprints they could match. They never found the person. I packed up that same afternoon and drove back down mountain. I didn't even ask for a refund. I just wanted to be gone. For weeks after, I kept thinking about it. Not just that someone had been under the cabin, but that they knew exactly where I was sleeping. That they waited, knocked when I was still, when I was alone, always beneath the bed, then the couch. Like they were listening, like they were tracking my position. They never broke in, never touched anything. But they were there, just a few feet beneath me, separated by floorboards and darkness. I didn't write anything for a long time after that. Even now, years later, I check under every floorboard in any cabin I rent. I never stay ground level anymore. And I don't sleep well if I hear even the smallest sound in the night. Because someone had been there, knocking just under my feet. And they left before anyone could find them. And no one knows if they ever came back. I used to rent out the back room of my house to short-term guests. It helped cover my mortgage, and for the most part, it went smoothly. The room had its own entrance and a small bathroom. I had a keypad lock on the door, so guests didn't have to interact with me unless they needed something. I kept it professional. Clean linens, stocked mini fridge, a coffee machine, just enough to be comfortable. One Thursday afternoon in early fall, a man named Keith booked the room for 4 nights. His profile said he was in town for work, a quiet guy, mid-40s. No red flags. He checked in late that evening. I heard his car pull in, the sound of the code being punched in, then the door closing. I didn't hear anything else after that. Seemed like a normal guest. The next morning, his car was still in the driveway when I left for work. I came back around 6 p.m. and it was still there. The blinds in his room were drawn tight. The porch light was on. I figured he must be working remote or on night shifts. Nothing odd. I didn't hear any noise from his room the whole night. It was the second day that I started to notice things. I have a small side yard with a wooden fence. My home office window faces that side. Around mid-morning, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked out and saw Keith standing in the yard, facing the fence, just standing there, perfectly still. No phone, no smoke, no drink, just standing with his arms down. I watched him for maybe 20 seconds. He didn't move. Then I turned away and tried to ignore it. After another few minutes, I peeked again. He was gone. That evening, I decided to check the exterior camera feeds. I had a few mounted, one at the front, one above the back porch, one covering the driveway. The side yard wasn't covered. Still, I scanned through the day's footage. Keith hadn't left. He hadn't gone anywhere. No food deliveries, no packages. He just stayed in. I don't know why, but something about that rubbed me the wrong way. On the third night, I was in bed reading when I heard faint footsteps in the hallway. Now, the guest room has its own entrance, so no one should be inside the main house. I froze and listened. The steps were slow, deliberate, and they were on my side of the house. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped quietly into the hall. Nothing. All the doors were closed. I checked the locks, front door, back door, all secure. I went back to my room and lay down, telling myself maybe it was the floor settling or something outside. But I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The basement door, inside the hallway near the kitchen, was unlocked. I never leave it that way. The basement wasn't for guests, and there was nothing down there except a washer, dryer, and storage. It creeped me out. I didn't go down, just locked it again, and try not to think too hard about it. That evening, I got home and noticed Keith's car was still in the driveway. He hadn't left once in 3 days. I knocked lightly on his door. No answer. I didn't press it. I had a rule not to invade guest privacy unless there was a clear reason. But something about this guy was making my skin itch. Later that night, I was brushing my teeth when I heard movement again. A soft creak, the kind old floorboards make under slow weight. I turned off the bathroom light and stood still, just listening. I heard it again, then another faint sound, like the rustle of clothing. I opened the bathroom door and looked into the hallway. It was dark, except for a bit of moonlight spilling through the living room window. Nothing there, but I couldn't shake the feeling someone was inside the house. I stayed up most of that night in bed, lights off, just listening. At around 3 a.m., I heard a sound that made my chest go tight, a slow turn of a doorknob. Not forceful, not jiggling, just a quiet testing of whether it would open. My bedroom door. I sat up slowly and didn't move. I didn't even breathe loud. I didn't hear footsteps walking away, just silence. I waited maybe 10 minutes before finally turning on the lamp. Nothing. The next morning, I checked the interior locks again. Still locked. I walked around the house, checking all the windows. The one in the laundry room was cracked open, just an inch, but enough. I always kept it locked. Always. It was one of those with a latch you had to push in. I locked it again. That evening, Keith's car was gone. For the first time since he arrived, he had left. I watched the cameras, waiting to see when he returned. He came back around 8 p.m., carrying what looked like a small duffel bag. No groceries, no food. Just that one bag. At this point, I knew I wasn't being paranoid. I waited until he went into his room. Then I went outside and checked the side yard. Right there in the grass were 2 cigarette butts. I don't allow smoking, and the listing clearly says that. They were fresh, slightly bent where they'd been put out in a hurry. And near them, I found footprints, just faint but visible in the patch of dirt, leading toward the living room window. I went back inside, locked everything again, and moved a heavy chair in front of my bedroom door. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a soft thud. I sat up and listened. Another thud, lower this time, like something hitting wood softly. Then came the creak, the sound of a door being opened. It wasn't mine. I stayed quiet and strained to listen. It was coming from the basement, the one door I had locked the day before. I got up slowly and pressed my ear to the wall. The noise was faint, but someone was walking in the basement. I picked up my phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. I told them I thought someone was in my house, possibly a guest who had broken into a part of the home that was off limits. The dispatcher said someone would be over within 20 minutes. I didn't wait. I opened my door carefully, flashlight in hand, and crept to the basement entrance. I listened again. Nothing now. Total silence. I slowly opened the door and pointed the light down. At the base of the stairs was a black shape. A bag. A large trash bag. I didn't go down. I backed away and shut the door. I waited outside on the porch until the police showed up. They went down first. I stayed at the top, heart racing. When the officers called up, "Do you know what this is?" They brought up 3 large trash bags. Each one had random items: cans of food, rolled socks, batteries, a knife, a bottle of rubbing alcohol, several of my own kitchen utensils. They also found a small camera tucked in the vent of the guest room, wired to a battery pack and a tiny SD card. He had taken it upon himself to install it, watching the house, probably watching me. They found signs he had been sneaking through the laundry window at night, getting into the house. That duffel bag, full of tools and zip ties. They arrested him that night. Apparently, Keith had a history. Nothing serious enough to flag his background check. Just small charges trespassing a protective order that had expired. But they believed he was planning something. No one could say exactly what. He never confessed to anything. Just kept quiet. I took down the listing the next day, changed all the locks, installed better cameras, and I haven't rented out that room again since. Every now and then, I still wake up around 3 a.m., heart pounding, listening, waiting to hear that soft turn of a doorknob again. It hasn't come, but I've never slept the same since. One fall, I was hiking through the woods in northern Michigan. I'd taken the week off work, rented a small cabin near a state forest, and planned to spend a few days hiking, reading, and staying off the grid. The kind of trip where I turned off my phone and let time slow down a little. The air was crisp, the leaves were already turning orange and red, and the forest floor was thick with fallen leaves. I liked the stillness of it all. No traffic, no voices, just the wind and my footsteps crunching underfoot. That day, I was doing a longer loop, about 12 miles. I started around 9 in the morning, a light pack on my shoulders, just water, a sandwich, and some basic gear. I didn't expect to see many people. It wasn't a popular trail, and it was midweek. The sky was overcast, and the air smelled like damp pine and rotting leaves. It felt peaceful. About halfway in, maybe 6 miles or so, I heard the first gunshot. It cracked through the quiet like a whip, echoing off the trees. Then another, not rapid, just spaced out. I froze for a second, then remembered it was hunting season. Not unusual. Still, I wasn't taking any chances. I pulled my orange vest out of the pack and slipped it on. It wasn't a big one, just one of those thin mesh types with reflective strips, but it would make me visible enough. I kept walking. The trail narrowed and twisted through thicker woods, mostly maples and oaks with their leaves starting to drop. A few minutes later, I noticed movement ahead, off the trail to the left. 3 men standing just beyond the trees, maybe 20 or 30 feet in. At first, I thought they were hunters. They wore full camo, head to toe, and they stood still, almost too still, like they were waiting. But they weren't holding rifles. One had a machete in his hand, just hanging loose at his side. Another had what looked like a crossbow strapped across his back. The third had nothing visible, but he stood with his arms crossed and didn't take his eyes off me. I nodded at them as I passed, just a polite gesture. Nothing too friendly, nothing too inviting. They didn't nod back, didn't say anything, just watched. I didn't break stride, but I felt the tension grow in my chest. Something about them felt wrong. Not like hunters. They weren't wearing the usual blaze orange, and there was no sign of hunting gear. No coolers, no field dressing kits, no dogs. Just machetes and silent staring. I picked up my pace a little, kept walking without looking back. The trail bent slightly and took me out of their line of sight after a minute or so. Still, I kept my ears sharp, listening for footsteps, for anything. Maybe half an hour later, I paused to drink water. I was back in a deeper stretch of woods, denser trees, darker under the canopy. That's when I heard it. A crack, like a branch snapping behind me. Not loud, but close enough to notice. I turned and scanned the woods. Nothing. Just trees, shadows, silence. I started walking again, trying to stay calm. A few minutes later, another crack, then rustling. It wasn't steady, but it came in bursts, like something moving, then stopping when I did. It could have been a deer. This area had tons of them, but it felt wrong. The pacing, the pauses. It matched mine too perfectly. Every time I stopped, it stopped. At that point, I wasn't interested in finding out what it was. I sped up. Not a run, not yet, but fast hiking. Pushing hard through the leaves, keeping my eyes on the path and my ears wide open. My heart started to pound. The forest felt different, like it was closing in. Everything sounded louder. My breathing, the leaves underfoot, even the wind. I didn't want to panic, but I was getting there fast. I kept moving like that for maybe 20 minutes, never seeing anyone, just hearing that distant crunch and snap behind me. Always just far enough back to stay out of sight. Then, finally, I saw two people up ahead, another pair of hikers coming the opposite direction. They were middle-aged, wearing jackets and day packs, walking slow and chatting. I felt this huge wave of relief. I didn't even say anything. I just slowed down as I passed, and then turned and started walking with them like it was the most natural thing. They didn't seem to notice or care. Just casual nods and small talk about the trail. I didn't explain what was happening. I didn't want to sound paranoid, and I wasn't sure what I'd even say. Hey, I think 3 guys with machetes might be following me. It sounded crazy, but I stayed with them, walked the rest of the way out. It took another hour and a half to reach the trailhead. The whole time, I didn't hear anything else behind us. No footsteps, no movement, just normal forest sounds. When we finally got back to the parking lot, the sun was lower in the sky, and everything was cast in that cold golden light that comes in the late afternoon. The lot was mostly empty. My car was at the far end, parked under a big pine. I felt that same calm come back. I made it. I was fine. Then I saw them again. The 3 men in camo were stepping out of the woods, maybe 40 feet from the edge of the lot. They didn't come all the way out, just enough to be seen. No weapons in sight now, just standing there, watching. One of them, the one with the crossbow from earlier, tilted his head a little and smiled. Not friendly, more like the kind of smile you give someone when you've got a secret. A smug, knowing kind of grin, like he knew I saw them, knew what had happened, and was okay with me knowing. I stared back for a few seconds, then turned away. Got in my car, locked the doors before even starting it. The other 2 hikers were already pulling out. I didn't wait around. I backed out fast and hit the road. I checked my mirror all the way back to the cabin. No one followed, nothing out of place. But I couldn't shake that smile. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how they had nothing to gain by just watching me. Why carry blades and crossbows on a hiking trail? Why no rifles during hunting season? Why follow me without doing anything? Unless doing nothing was the point. Just enough to scare. Just enough to show me they could. I cut my trip short, left the cabin the next morning, and drove home. Never filed a report. What would I even say? There was no crime, no confrontation. Just watching. Just that awful silence and the feeling of being followed. But I've never gone back to that part of Michigan. And I still think about that smile sometimes. I booked the cabin for a week to get away from everything. Work had been non-stop. My head felt heavy all the time, and I just needed quiet. The place looked perfect online, set back in the woods about 30 minutes from the nearest small town in Vermont. The picture showed a small single-story log cabin with a front porch, some old furniture, and a wood-burning stove. I didn't care about luxury. I just wanted to sleep in, make coffee, and read. When I arrived, everything looked just like the pictures. The gravel driveway crunched under my tires. The trees were tall and thick, wrapping the place in shade, even though it was mid-afternoon. It was cooler than I expected, just a little bite in the air. I brought in my bags, checked the cabinets, tried the water, and got the heat going. There was a musty smell at first, like the place had been closed up for a while, but it cleared out after I opened some windows. The layout was simple. Living room straight ahead when you walk in, kitchen off to the left, and a hallway running down to the right side where the bedroom and bathroom were. I noticed the door in the hallway right away. It was on the left side of the hallway, across from the bedroom. Plain white paint, metal handle, no keyhole, just a standard interior door with a basic knob. I tried it. Locked. Didn't think much of it at the time. I figured it was a storage closet or maybe where they kept supplies for the cleaner. A lot of Airbnb hosts did that, left one door locked for themselves. I unpacked, made a sandwich, sat on the porch for a while. The quiet out there was heavy, but in a good way. No cars, no phones ringing, just birds and the occasional creak of the trees swaying. That night, I lit a fire in the stove and read until I got tired. I went to bed around 10. Sometime deep into the night, I woke up. It wasn't a sound that pulled me out of sleep. It was just that strange shift in awareness you feel when something's different. I lay there for a second, listening. At first, I thought maybe it was just the creaking of the cabin settling. That happened in old houses. But then I heard it, faint movement. Not like footsteps, more like the sound of someone adjusting in bed, shifting their weight slowly. It was coming from the hallway, from behind that locked door. I stayed still, my eyes wide open in the dark. I didn't want to move. I just listened. It lasted maybe 10 or 15 seconds. Then nothing. I told myself it was probably mice in the walls or an animal into the house. It was the woods. That kind of thing wasn't unusual. In the morning, I messaged the host. Nothing dramatic. Just asked, hey, just checking. Anyone else staying on the property? I heard some sound from the locked door last night. Just curious if it's connected to another part of the house. She replied an hour later. No, that's just a storage area. Been sealed for years. No one else there. That stuck with me. Sealed for years. That made the sounds even harder to explain. But again, I try to brush it off. Old cabins make noise. Animals move around. My brain was probably just running wild after a deep sleep. But it happened again the second night. Same thing. Woke up to that feeling. I didn't hear footsteps. Just a small thump. Then the sound of weight shifting. A cough. Very soft, like someone trying not to be loud. But it was clear. Too human to mistake for anything else. It lasted longer that time. I lay in bed staring at the dark ceiling, holding my breath. I didn't sleep much after that. During the day, everything felt normal. Sunlight came through the windows, birds chirped outside, and the forest looked calm. But I kept thinking about that door. I checked it again that afternoon. Still locked. I even pressed my ear against it for a minute or two. Nothing. No movement. No breathing. Just silence. That night, I got more serious about it. I placed a wooden chair in front of the door. On top of the chair, I balanced an empty glass bottle. It was one of the Pellegrino bottles I'd brought with me. It was tall, with a narrow neck, and would easily tip over if anything bumped the chair. The idea wasn't to catch anyone. It was just to confirm if I was imagining things. If I woke up and everything was still in place, maybe it was just animals or old pipes or dreams bleeding into waking. But if it moved, that night, I went to bed more tense than the others. I didn't even try to read. I just lay there waiting for the quiet to turn strange again. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I remember was the sound of something hitting the floor and breaking. I sat up fast. My heart started pounding hard before I was even fully awake. It was pitch black, but I didn't move right away. I just listened. There was nothing, not even the usual creaks. But I knew what I'd heard. That bottle. The sound was too sharp to be anything else. I got up, turned on the bedroom light, and walked slowly into the hallway. The chair had been pushed back a foot or two. Not knocked over, just moved. The bottle was in pieces across the floor. I picked up one of the larger shards, cold and smooth in my hand. The door itself was still locked. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat on the couch with the light on, blanket wrapped around me, listening to every sound the cabin made. Nothing else happened, but that didn't make me feel better. In the morning, I packed my things. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't clean up the mess. I just loaded my car and left. Before I pulled out of the driveway, I sent the host a message letting her know I'd left early. I didn't explain why. I didn't ask for anything. She replied 10 minutes later. Thanks for letting me know. I'll refund the last night's stay. That was it. No questions. I drove straight home. My chest didn't start to relax until I was about 20 miles out, where the forest gave way to open fields. I still think about that door. I still hear that sound sometimes in my head, quiet, deliberate movement, like someone lying just on the other side of the wall, wide awake. I went camping solo in a quiet section of national forest land somewhere in northern Idaho. I'd spent weeks staring at maps online, looking for a place off the beaten path, something away from people, away from cell service, just quiet woods and time to myself. Eventually, I found a spot, a patch of forest with no trails, no campsites, no signs, just green on the map. There was a single dirt road that led in that direction, barely a road anymore, just a narrow path through tall trees with a few pull-off spots along the way. I parked my car on one of those dirt pull-offs and loaded up my pack. I had enough gear and food for 3 days, and I planned to be completely alone the entire time. I hiked in about 2 miles, not on any trail, just bushwhacking through brush and stepping over deadfall. It wasn't too hard. This part of the forest was quiet, peaceful, not too dense. I found a small stream running through a flat clearing, shaded by tall pines and birch. It looked perfect. I set up my tent a few feet back from the water, got a small fire going with dead wood, and settled in. That first night was everything I hoped it would be. Crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere off in the distance, the soft rush of a stream. The air was cool and crisp. I sat by the fire, warmed a can of food, and then lay back in my sleeping bag feeling like I had made the right choice to come out here. No stress, no people, no noise except for the woods. I fell asleep without any trouble at all. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It was still pitch dark, no hint of sunrise yet. And it wasn't a sound that woke me. It was a feeling, like when someone is staring at you, like the space around you isn't empty anymore. I didn't move. I just lay there in my sleeping bag, eyes open, listening. My heart started to pick up, and my ears were wide open, trying to catch anything. A stick snap, a footstep, anything. But there was nothing, just the same stream trickling along. Same occasional chirp of a cricket. No wind, no footsteps. I kept still, barely breathing. I even held my breath at times, trying to hear better. Eventually, I must have drifted back off to sleep, because the next thing I remember was sunlight cutting through the trees and the sound of birds in the distance. It was early. The fire had long since gone out. I crawled out of the tent, stretched a bit, and walked over to the water to splash some on my face. And then I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They were around my tent in the soft dirt. Not just one or two, but a whole circle. Someone had walked around my tent. Slowly. Twice, maybe 3 times. The ground was soft enough to show tread patterns, and they definitely weren't mine. Different size. Deeper in some spots, like whoever made them was standing still and shifting their weight. I stood there staring for a long time, just trying to make sense of it. There were no other campsites nearby. I hadn't passed anyone hiking in. No tire tracks by the road. No voices in the woods. Nothing. I was 10 miles from the nearest ranger station, and that was in a different direction. Whoever it was, they came through this forest without leaving much sign, just those prints. And they were fresh. I kept trying to come up with a reason someone would be out here. Maybe another camper I just hadn't seen. Maybe a hunter, even though it wasn't hunting season. Maybe a ranger, though they usually announce themselves and don't creep around people's tents in the middle of the night. None of it made sense. I walked a wide circle around the clearing, looking for more prints, more signs, broken branches, torn leaves, anything. I found nothing. Whoever it was didn't leave a trail, or they were damn good at hiding it. The rest of the day, I tried to shake it off. I told myself maybe I made a mistake. Maybe the prints were from the day before, and I just hadn't noticed them. But that wasn't true, and I knew it. Still, I didn't want to pack up and hike out yet. I had 2 more nights planned and enough supplies. I just stayed alert, checked my knife, and kept the fire bigger that evening. That night, I didn't sleep. I turned off my lantern early and just lay in the tent, completely silent, staring at the dark ceiling. I had my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other. I didn't zip up my sleeping bag. I kept my boots on. I wanted to be ready. The woods were different that night. Not loud, not active, just still. No wind, barely any insect sounds. It was like everything had stopped moving. I waited, listening for hours. Every creak of a branch outside made my heart thump. At one point, a squirrel ran across the top of the tent, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. But then, maybe around 1 a.m., I heard it, breathing. Not animal, not snorting or snuffling, not sniffing. It was slow, controlled, human, just outside the tent. I held my breath. I didn't move. I could hear it long, quiet inhales and exhales. Not panicked, not loud, calm, steady. It was maybe 3 feet from me, just a thin nylon wall between us. I didn't hear footsteps, just breathing, like someone was kneeling or crouching right beside the tent. I stayed like that for hours. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't move the knife. My hand was stiff from gripping it so tight. The breathing would pause for minutes at a time, and I'd think it was gone, but then it would start again, even softer. Sometimes it would move slightly, like someone shifting their weight, but there were never footsteps. No leaves crunching, no zipper, just presence. When the sky finally started to brighten and the light started leaking through the nylon, the breathing stopped. I waited until full daylight before unzipping the tent. There was no one. I stepped out slowly. The woods looked calm again. Still, the same as yesterday morning. I checked around the tent again. No new footprints. Nothing had been taken or moved. But then I saw it. Directly across from the tent, on the nearest tree, carved in the bark in block letters, rough but readable, was a single word. Stay. It hadn't been there yesterday. I would have noticed. I had walked right past that tree at least twice. It was fresh, jagged bits of bark still on the ground beneath it. The letters were cut deep. Someone had done it recently, and they had taken their time. I stood there, staring at it, and something cold ran through me. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a threat. It was a message. And the way it was written, it wasn't rushed. It wasn't done in fear. It was calm, like whoever wrote it knew I would see it, like they wanted me to. I packed up in under 10 minutes. Tent, sleeping bag, food, everything. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't take photos. I didn't even bother trying to follow the stream back. I went in a straight line through the woods, checking over my shoulder every few minutes, listening for sound behind me. My heart didn't slow down until I saw the glint of my car through the trees. When I got back to the road, there were no other vehicles, no other signs of people. I threw my gear in the back seat, locked the doors, and drove until I got signal again. I didn't stop. I didn't report anything. I didn't post about it online. I just went home. I've been camping my whole life. I've spent nights alone in the desert, in the mountains, deep in swamps. I've seen bears, heard mountain lions, gotten caught in storms, and slept in soaked clothes. But I've never gone back to that part of the forest. Not even close. And I never will. I booked the Airbnb for a long weekend, Friday to Monday. It was a 2-story house tucked into a quiet suburb with a clean driveway, trimmed hedges, and a little front porch with 2 white chairs. It wasn't far from the city, but it felt peaceful. The inside was cozy, just like the photos, light gray walls, hardwood floors, and simple modern furniture. It had 2 bedrooms upstairs and an open living room downstairs that led into a small kitchen and dining area. I got there late Friday afternoon. The host had sent me the code for the lockbox, and everything went smoothly. Inside, the house smelled like vanilla-scented air freshener. There were fresh towels on the bed, a welcome note on the counter, and even a little bag of snacks by the coffee machine. It felt normal, welcoming even. I unpacked, made myself a quick sandwich, and lounged on the couch watching Netflix for a while. It had been a long week at work, and I was looking forward to doing absolutely nothing for 3 days. That night, after showering and brushing my teeth, I went upstairs to the guest room, the one with the softer mattress, and crawled under the covers. As I turned off the light, I noticed something above the hallway between the 2 bedrooms. It was an attic access panel, a small rectangular door in the ceiling. That wasn't strange. Lots of houses had them, but something about this one made me look twice. It wasn't flush with the ceiling. One corner sagged slightly, just enough to cast a shadow. And around the edges of the frame, there were dark smudges, like fingerprints or dirty streaks. I figured maybe a repair guy had been up there recently, maybe checking insulation or wiring. Still, I remember pausing for a moment, staring at it longer than I needed to, before shrugging it off and going to bed. The first night passed quietly. I didn't hear anything strange. But on Saturday morning, when I was brushing my teeth, I glanced up at the attic panel again. It still looked off-center. I stood under it for a second, craning my neck, but I wasn't tall enough to see much. I thought about pulling over a chair and checking it out, but I decided it wasn't my business. It wasn't my house. The day went by uneventfully. I drove out to get lunch, walked around a local park, and stopped at a small bookstore. I got back to the house around 6 p.m. and spent the evening on the couch watching a movie and scrolling through my phone. Around 11 p.m., I turned off the lights, locked the doors, and went upstairs. That night, I fell asleep quickly, but woke up at some point to a noise. I wasn't sure what time it was. Everything was dark, and I hadn't looked at my phone yet. I lay still for a second, listening. I thought I heard something above me. A soft creak, then another one, slower, like someone shifting their weight on an old floorboard. It was quiet, barely there, but it didn't sound like the house settling. It sounded more deliberate, like movement. I tried to convince myself it was just the wood expanding or cooling off, but something about it made my skin crawl. Eventually, I dozed off again. But when I got up to use the bathroom around 3 a.m., I walked out into the hallway and immediately stopped. The attic panel, the same one that had looked a little off before, was now open. Just a few inches, enough that I could see darkness inside. The gap was thin, but it hadn't been there earlier. I froze. I didn't breathe. I just stood there, staring up at it. My first thought was, maybe it slipped open on its own, but it hadn't been loose before. It had stayed in place since I arrived, and now it was hanging open like someone had pushed it from the inside. My second thought was, there's someone up there. I backed slowly into the bedroom, shut the door without making a sound, and locked it. My hand was shaking. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening. I couldn't hear anything now. No footsteps, no movement. But I couldn't stop staring at the door, wondering if I should call the police. I kept trying to think logically, trying to come up with a reason why the panel would be open. But I kept going back to the same thought. I didn't open it. After maybe 20 minutes, I went back out into the hallway, more cautious this time. I didn't want to get close to the panel, but I didn't want to leave it like that either. I walked downstairs and found a broom in the kitchen closet. Then I brought a chair from the dining room and stood on it carefully, broom in hand, trying not to make noise. I poked at the panel, slowly lifting it back into place until it was flat against the ceiling. I held it there for a second, gently tapped the corners, then stepped down. There was no latch, nothing to lock it. I didn't go back to the bedroom. I stayed downstairs on the couch for the rest of the night, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the ceiling. Every little creak made my chest tighten. I kept glancing at the staircase, half expecting someone to come down. But nothing happened. Morning came slowly, and when the light started coming in through the windows, I felt a small bit of relief. I waited until a reasonable hour, around 9 a.m., and messaged the host. I kept it calm, just said I noticed the attic panel open during the night, and asked if there was any chance someone else had access to the house. She responded an hour later. Her reply was short and weirdly casual. She said she was so sorry about that, and then admitted her ex-boyfriend used to help with repairs and technically still had a copy of the key. She claimed he didn't come by anymore and that she had told him not to, but she didn't seem surprised by my message at all. She just said she'd look into it and understood if I wanted to check out early. That was it. No apology, no offer of a refund, no explanation for the open attic panel. I didn't respond. I packed everything in under 10 minutes, threw my bag in the car, and drove away without looking back. I didn't feel safe staying another night. The worst part wasn't the panel being open. It was the fact that someone had probably been in that attic while I was sleeping. Maybe listening, maybe watching. There were no locks on the attic access, no cameras in the house, nothing stopping someone from climbing down in the middle of the night except my presence. And even that didn't feel like enough. I reported the incident to Airbnb support later that day, but I never heard anything about it again. I left a review, but I kept it vague, not wanting to start a back and forth with the host. The house looked safe from the outside. It felt normal, up until it didn't. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I stay in unfamiliar places. Now I always check the ceilings. I check for attic panels, loose tiles, crawl spaces, anything that looks like it leads somewhere a person could hide. Because trust isn't enough. Not when someone else has the key. I rented a small loft-style Airbnb while I was in town to visit a few galleries that had picked up some of my photography work. I shoot mostly black and white street photography, and This was the first time I'd had more than one gallery show my stuff at once. I felt proud, but also exhausted, so I booked a place that seemed quiet and unique, somewhere I could edit in peace, maybe even unwind with a few new shots around the city. The Airbnb was on the top floor of an old brick building, tucked into a quieter street that still buzzed a little at night. The listing had said artistic loft with vintage charm, and it was exactly that. Tall windows with sheer curtains, worn hardwood floors, and mismatched antique furniture. A clawfoot tub in the bathroom, a velvet armchair in the corner. The whole space felt a little dusty, like it had stories of its own. But I liked that. It felt like it had character. There was a large wooden desk near the far wall beneath a window, a heavy thing with little drawers and brass handles. On top of it sat a big sketch pad, closed, along with a small glass jar filled with pencils. I figured the owner might be an artist or leave it there for guests to doodle. It didn't feel weird, at least not then. I carried my bags up the stairs, set my gear on the table, and walked through the space slowly. The bed was tucked into a sleeping nook, kind of a half wall that separated it from the rest of the loft, but not fully closed off. From the desk, you could see right into the bed area. That stuck with me later. The first day passed without anything strange. I went to a gallery opening, had a quick drink with some friends, then came back and edited photos until midnight. I fell asleep fast. The second day was the same, busy, routine, comfortable. It wasn't until the third day that I noticed the sketch pad again. I was drinking coffee at the desk that morning, scrolling through a batch of test prints I brought, when I absently reached over and flipped open the pad. I wasn't even thinking about it. It was just there, and I was a little bored. The first few pages were nothing. Loose figure drawings, a couple still life sketches of fruit or furniture, and what looked like warm-up doodles. But as I turned to the next page, my eyes caught on something that made me freeze. There was a detailed pencil sketch of a person in bed. Not just any bed, it was the same one I was sleeping in. The same blanket, same pillows. And the angle was unmistakable. It was drawn from where the desk sat, the exact view someone would have if they were sitting here, watching. The person in the bed had their back turned, hair messy, one arm out from under the covers. It looked like me. I stared at the drawing for a long time. I told myself it could just be a coincidence. Maybe the host liked to draw this room. Maybe it was a self-portrait from years ago. But I turned the page again. Another drawing. This time, it showed someone brushing their teeth in front of the bathroom mirror. The layout was accurate. The sketch had little details, my black t-shirt hanging off the towel hook, a phone charger plugged into the wall behind me. I checked the date written in the corner. It was 3 days ago. My stomach started to tighten. I flipped through the pad faster now. One after another, sketches of me doing everyday things inside this loft. Sitting at the desk, eating a sandwich, lying on the bed with my laptop. All from angles inside the room. Always from somewhere else in the space. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone stayed here before who looked like me. Maybe these were made months ago and just happened to match what I was doing. But the timestamps on some of the drawings, written lightly in the corner in pencil, matched the exact dates I had been there. I started taking pictures of each sketch with my phone, one by one, flipping through them with growing dread. My hands were shaking a little. Some of the drawings showed me from such intimate angles, moments I hadn't even remembered doing. One sketch showed me yawning and stretching, eyes still squinting with sleep. Another had me curled up in bed, one leg out of the blanket, exactly like I had been that first night. I looked around the loft slowly. Something shifted in me. My neck started to itch. I suddenly hated the openness of the place, the way the bed wasn't fully closed off. How easy it would be to watch someone from behind the desk, or even from one of the shadowed corners near the ceiling beams. There was no TV in the unit, no obvious electronics besides the small Bluetooth speaker on the shelf. I scanned the room for anything that looked out of place. Vents, wall hangings, picture frames. I even checked behind a mirror in the bathroom, but I didn't find anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I had been watched since the moment I arrived. I packed my stuff immediately. I threw my clothes into my duffel bag, grabbed my camera, laptop, all my chargers. I didn't bother folding anything. I just needed to leave. The street was still quiet when I walked out. I remember the sound of my bag wheels bouncing on the old sidewalk, how loud it felt in the morning stillness. I got into my car and just sat there for a few minutes, heart still racing. Before I pulled away, I sent a message to Airbnb through the app and uploaded the photos I had taken to the sketchpad. I didn't say much, just that I found disturbing drawings that suggested someone had been watching me and that I no longer felt safe in the unit. A few hours later, I got a call from our customer service. They refunded me in full and said they were looking into the matter and had put a temporary hold on the listing. The host replied to my message, too. He said he'd been inspired by guests over the years and that the drawings were his way of capturing the spirit of the place. He claimed it was a long-time habit, not meant to make anyone uncomfortable. But that didn't explain how the sketches were so recent or how they matched everything I'd done in that loft down to the smallest details. It didn't explain the perspective of the drawings, always from somewhere else in the room, always as if someone had been sitting there silently watching me. I didn't respond to him. I didn't want anything more to do with it. I haven't stayed in an Airbnb since. Hotels might be more expensive, but at least I know who has access to my room. And I never flip open strange notebooks anymore, not even out of habit. It was the third day of my solo trek through the backwoods of Kentucky. I planned a 5-day loop, nothing extreme, just long enough to get away from everything. No cell service, no roads, no people. Just a pack, a topo map, and the trail under my boots. I camped near a creek the night before, woke up early, packed up my gear, and hit the trail by 7 a.m. The woods were quiet. Damp pine needles softened my steps. A thin layer of mist still hung low in some spots, especially around the hollows. It was peaceful, the kind of peace you can only find miles away from anything man-made. About mid-morning, maybe around 10, I came to a narrow bend in the trail. That's when I saw it. A strip of yellow caution tape stretched between two trees on either side of the path. It was bright, fresh-looking, fluttering slightly in the breeze. I stopped and just stared at it for a moment. There was no sign explaining it. No trail closure notice, no downed trees, no hazard. It didn't look like the kind of tape you see from trail maintenance crews either. Just a single strand of caution tape, stretched across the trail like a barrier. It was strange, but I wasn't about to turn back. I figured maybe some hunters or surveyors had left it there and forgot to remove it. I checked the map. My route should have been clear. I looked around. Nothing else unusual. So I stepped off the trail and bushwhacked around it about 20 yards to the side, then rejoined the trail on the other side. Nothing else seemed off for a while, but about 10 or 15 minutes later, I noticed another piece of tape. This time, it was tied low across the path, ankle height. It almost looked like it was meant to trip someone. I stopped again and stared at it. Still no signs, still no reason for it. Just this yellow strip, tight and deliberate, stretched low across the trail. I stepped over it and kept going, but a knot had started to form in my stomach. My pace slowed a bit, and I kept scanning the woods more often now. Not even 5 minutes later, another strip. This one chest high. Then another one, tied between two small saplings just off the trail, like it had been there a while, but was recently retied. Each time I saw one, I felt more off. Not scared, exactly, but that cold tingle in your arms, like your instinct to try and get your attention. I looked for other footprints, for any sign someone else had been through recently, but the trail was dry and packed down. Nothing fresh. After a while, the tape stopped. I didn't see any for a good stretch, maybe half a mile, and I started to relax a bit. I was still uneasy, but I kept going. The trail began to open up, trees thinning, and then I reached a clearing. A wide one. It didn't feel like a natural meadow, more like something had pushed the trees out. There was no grass, just packed dirt, roots, and patches of moss. I stepped in slowly, scanning the area. Then I saw the clothes. Rows of them, not hung or piled, laid out flat on the ground, like someone had taken them off and set them there with care. Shirts, jeans, jackets, socks, even boots. All of them spaced out evenly, maybe 3 feet apart in each direction. At least 20 full outfits. Some looked old and sun-faded. Others were dirty, but more recent. The boots especially. Some had mud still caked in the soles, like they'd been worn just days ago. There were no backpacks, no wallets, no gear. just clothing arranged in a grid. I stood there for a long time, not moving. Every instinct in me screamed that I shouldn't be there. It didn't make sense. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, nothing torn. Just clothes, all human-sized, adult sizes mostly, a few smaller sets. It felt wrong, like I'd walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. I didn't know what this place was, but I knew I didn't want to be there anymore. I turned around fast, walked quickly back the way I came, tried to retrace my steps. I didn't run. I didn't want to trip, didn't want to panic. But I walked hard. I kept my eyes sharp, looking for the bend in the trail that would lead me out of that clearing. That's when I saw the tape again. A new strip tied across the trail I had just walked. It hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. It was tied tight, waist height, pulled clean between two trees. The knot was fresh. The tape was clean. I froze. My breathing got shallow. I looked behind me, nothing. I looked off trail, through the trees. Nothing moved, no sound. The woods were too quiet. No bird song, no squirrels, just the wind and my breath. Someone had to be out here. Someone who didn't want people passing through. Someone who had seen me, maybe even watched me in that clearing. I backed away slowly from the new strip of tape. Then I stepped off trail again, trying to find a new way around, cutting wide this time, maybe 40 yards to the side. I didn't want to follow the same trail out in case they were waiting along it. I bushwhacked through undergrowth, breaking twigs, ducking under branches. It was slow going, and every few minutes I stopped and listened. Nothing, just my own footsteps and my own breath. After a while, I found a small dry creek bed and followed it downhill, thinking it might intersect the trail farther back where I'd come from that morning. I kept moving, keeping my direction steady with the sun and compass, trying not to think about the clearing or the tape. After about an hour of scrambling through the woods, I finally saw the trail again. Relief hit hard. I climbed back up onto it, looking both ways. No tape, nothing on the path. I turned in the direction of my previous night's camp, planning to double back and exit early. I had enough food and water to get back to my car by late evening if I kept a strong pace. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't stop to rest. Just walked. Hiked fast, steady. Every now and then I glanced behind me, but I never saw anyone. I started seeing familiar terrain again. Rocks I remembered, a fallen log I'd stepped over yesterday. I was back in a zone I knew, and that helped. I made it back to the pull-off where my car was parked just before dusk. I threw my pack in the back seat, locked the doors, and sat there for a long minute, tried to breathe normally. My clothes were damp with sweat. My hands were shaking. I didn't understand what I'd seen out there, and I still don't. But I knew I wasn't supposed to see it. When I got home, I looked online for anything about that trail. Missing hikers, odd sightings, backwoods dangers, anything. But I found nothing. No official warnings, no reports. The area was listed as safe, just remote. I never went back. I've hiked since then, different places, always more populated, always with others. But that clearing, those clothes, the fresh tape, those images still hit me sometimes when the woods go too quiet. Whatever I walked into out there, it was an accident. It was deliberate, planned, set up, and whoever set it up was still out there. I booked a high-rise Airbnb in the city for a quick 3-day work trip. It was in a nice building, one of those newer glass towers that looks sleek on the outside and smells like fresh paint in the halls. I picked it because it was close to the conference center, and the pictures made it look clean and modern. When I arrived, everything seemed fine. The check-in was smooth, the key was in a lockbox, the lobby was quiet, and the elevator was fast. The apartment itself was small but tidy. White walls, pale wood floors, big windows with blackout curtains, a compact kitchen. It had a minimalist kind of vibe. There was a little desk near the window, a small sofa, and a mounted TV. I wasn't planning on spending much time inside anyway, just sleeping and maybe checking a few emails before heading out to meetings. But there's one thing that stood out immediately, a huge mirror on the bedroom wall, right across from the bed. It stretched almost floor to ceiling and spanned the width of the wall. It wasn't a fancy frame or anything, just a basic rectangular slab. But it looked odd. I couldn't explain it right away, but something about it felt wrong. The light hit it in a strange way, and the reflection seemed ever so slightly distorted. Not like a funhouse mirror, but just enough that it fell off. At first, I chalked it up to travel fatigue. I've been up since 5 a.m., flying, sitting in a cab, checking emails on the ride. I unpacked quickly, set up my laptop on the desk, and took a shower. I ordered some takeout, ate in front of my laptop, and then got into bed early. But even lying there, I couldn't stop glancing at the mirror. I wasn't paranoid usually. I'd stayed in dozens of Airbnbs before, even weirder ones, cabins, shared houses, one time even a converted garage, but this was the first time something truly unsettled me. It was the way the edges of the mirror didn't quite touch the wall. There was maybe a 1/4-inch gap running around the entire border, just enough to see a shadowy line between the mirror and the drywall. And when I looked closely, the surface didn't reflect like proper glass. It had a dullness to it. I leaned over and tapped on it lightly with my knuckle. It didn't sound like glass. Glass has that crisp, high-pitched sound when you tap it. This was dull, almost like plastic. The kind of sound you'd hear tapping on a plexiglass divider or an old picture frame with a plastic front. I try not to overthink it. I told myself it was probably a cheap mirror from a hardware store. Maybe the owner didn't install it properly. Maybe the wall was just uneven. Still, I didn't like it. I tried to ignore it and sleep, but my eyes kept flicking toward the reflection. Even with the lights off, the street lights through the curtains lit the room just enough to keep the mirror visible. And it felt like it was watching me more than reflecting me. I ended up tossing a bath towel over part of it and finally managed to fall asleep. The next morning I got dressed, grabbed a coffee downstairs, and went to my meetings. I didn't think about the mirror for most of the day. I was busy, distracted, talking to people. But that night, when I got back to the apartment, the feeling returned as soon as I stepped into the bedroom. I stared at that mirror for a long time. The room was silent, and all I could hear was the distant hum of traffic below and the occasional creak of the building settling. I couldn't shake it. Something was wrong. I stood in front of the mirror and ran my fingers around the edge. The border was loose, not fully flush with the wall. I pulled just a little bit, not enough to break anything, but enough to test it. And it shifted, not by much, but it moved like it was attached with magnets or weak adhesive. My chest tightened. I hesitated. Then I got my phone, turned on the flashlight, and carefully pulled one edge of the mirror away from the wall. It made a slight cracking sound like glue peeling off paint. I angled my light behind it and froze. There was a hole, a rectangular cutout in the drywall, maybe 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall. Inside, nestled on a small wooden shelf screwed into the studs, was a camera, a GoPro, positioned to face directly into the bedroom, angled perfectly toward the bed. It wasn't on, at least I didn't see a light, but it was mounted and aimed like it was ready to record. Wires trailed down behind the shelf into the darkness of the wall, but I couldn't see where they went. I backed away immediately. My heart was racing, not like from fear of a ghost or something irrational. This was real, physical. Someone had placed a camera behind a fake mirror, pointing at the bed I had just slept in. I took photos of everything, the hole, the camera, the mirror, the wires. I even took a short video, narrating the time and date as I showed the camera through the gap. My hands were shaking. I left the apartment that minute. I didn't pack. I grabbed my wallet, phone, and laptop and went straight to the lobby. I sat in one of the chairs near the entrance and pulled up the Airbnb app. I reported the listing immediately and uploaded the photos. I also called their support line and explained everything in detail. To their credit, they took it seriously. Within 30 minutes, someone from their trust and safety team called me back and said they were relocating me to a hotel nearby and would launch an investigation. I went to the hotel, still unsettled. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of a clean, generic hotel room, and I couldn't stop thinking about that hole in the wall. That camera, that mirror. How many people had stayed in that room and never noticed? How many had been recorded without knowing? I didn't sleep much. The next day, I checked out of the hotel and flew back home. Work was done, but the whole experience stuck in my head. I followed up with Airbnb a few times, and 2 weeks later, they finally sent me an update. According to them, the camera didn't contain a memory card. It wasn't actively recording, and the property owner claimed it belonged to a previous tenant, and had supposedly been forgotten inside the wall during renovations. They said the unit had changed hands a few times over the years. Airbnb said they couldn't prove intent, but they still removed the listing out of an abundance of caution. It didn't make me feel any better. The idea that someone had drilled a hole in the wall and mounted a camera pointed at the bed didn't seem like an accident. Whether or not it had been used recently, someone had put it there on purpose. Maybe they had removed the card before I arrived. Maybe the camera was Wi-Fi enabled and sent footage somewhere else. I'll never know. Since then, I've changed. I still travel. I still use Airbnb sometimes. But I check everything now. Every mirror, every vent, every smoke detector. I tap on the walls. I look for tiny lights, holes, anything unusual. I don't care if I look paranoid. I'd rather look paranoid than be watched in my sleep. And I'll never forget that feeling, the cold, steady stare of my own reflection in a mirror that was never really a mirror at all. My friends and I have been planning the reunion for months. We picked a quiet campground in the mountains, the kind with small, spaced-out rental cabins. We were able to book 3 of them, cabins 1, 2, and 4. The one in between, cabin 3, wasn't available for rent according to the front office. They said it was under maintenance. That worked out fine for us though. We had a small group, 7 people total, and we liked the extra space. Cabins 1 and 2 were next to each other, and cabin 4 was just a short walk down the gravel path. We liked the setup. The cabins were basic. Wood-framed, small front porches, dim yellow lights over the doors, a picnic table outside each. Inside, each cabin had 2 small bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with mismatched furniture and a dusty fireplace that didn't work. They weren't luxury places, but they were quiet and surrounded by trees. No cell signal unless you walked up toward the office. It was the kind of place where you heard every twig snap at night. The first day went by fast. We grilled burgers, sat around a fire pit near cabin 2, passed drinks back and forth. We stayed up late, laughing and talking. It felt good to be together again. The second day we went on a hike, then swam in the lake nearby. By the time the sun went down, we were all tired but happy. That night, after dinner, we were sitting outside on the picnic table near cabin 2 when I noticed something strange. A light was on in cabin 3. At first, I thought maybe one of us had gone in there for some reason. But I remembered clearly we had no key for it, and the office had said it was off limits. A single light glowed from the front window. It wasn't very bright, but it was clearly on. The rest of the cabin was dark. No porch light, no sound, no movement. I pointed out. A few of the others got up to look. We stood there for a while, watching. Nothing happened. We joked about it being haunted, or maybe a maintenance worker staying there without telling anyone. No one seemed too worried, and we had drinks in our hands, so after a few minutes we let it go. But later that night, after everyone split up and went back to their cabins, I saw something else. I was in cabin 1, sharing it with 2 friends. One of them was already in bed, the other in the shower. I stepped outside to smoke, and while I was on the porch, I glanced over at cabin 3 again. There was movement, not the light this time, but a shadow passing in front of the window. It was quick, but clear, like someone walking by inside. Just one person. I stared for a long time after that, waiting to see more. But nothing happened. The light was still on. The rest of the cabins stayed dark. The next morning, I mentioned it again. A few of us decided to check with the front office. It was a short walk uphill. The guy at the desk looked confused when we asked. He said again that cabin 3 was empty. No one should have been in there. There was no key checked out, and no power should even be running to that unit. Said something about a bad breaker box, and that the cabin had been used for storage anyway. We laughed it off, made a few jokes about squatters or ghosts, and went back to our day. But that night, things changed. We were sitting around the fire again, this time closer to cabin 1. It was cooler than the night before, and the wind was moving through the trees. The fire crackled and popped, and someone had music playing low from a speaker. We were telling stories when one of my friends nudged me and pointed. The light in cabin 3 was on again. We all turned to look. There was a strange kind of silence that settled over the group. We watched the cabin without saying anything. Then the shadow passed again, just once across the window. No shape we could clearly define, but definitely a person. The kind of movement you don't mistake. Too smooth to be a tree or a trick of light. A few of us got up. We weren't drunk, just uneasy. We made our way down the gravel path toward the cabin. It was silent except for the crunch of our shoes and the wind in the trees. When we reached the front of the cabin, we knocked. No answer. We knocked louder. Still nothing. We exchanged glances and decided to walk around to the back. The ground was uneven, and there was no clear path. Branches snapped under our feet. There was a small back window, and through it, we saw the same shadow again. This time, it moved from one side of the room to the other and disappeared, like someone ducking behind something. We didn't know what to do, so we called the police. The dispatcher said they'd send someone. It took about 20 minutes for the car to pull up. 2 officers stepped out, asked us some questions, then unlocked the cabin with a master key from the office. Inside, it smelled damp and old. The air was still musty. There was nothing in the cabin, no furniture except a single mattress on the floor in the living room. No blankets, no sheets, just a bare mattress. And the walls, all 4 of them were covered in photos. Dozens of them, printed on glossy paper, some curling at the edges, others freshly taped up. All of them were pictures of us, taken over the last 2 days. Some were from when we were grilling, some from when we were at the fire. A few were from the hike. One was from earlier that evening, before the sun had gone down completely, when 2 of us had walked back from the lake. We hadn't noticed anyone taking them. No clicks, no flashes. Whoever did it had been close, hiding in the trees, behind cabins, maybe even watching us through the windows at night. The officers didn't find anyone inside. No signs of forced entry. No weapons. Just the photos and the mattress. They checked the woods, drove around the property, even knocked on a few other cabins to ask questions. But no one had seen anything. They took down our statements and told us we could press charges if we wanted, but since no crime had technically been committed, no break-in to our own cabins, no direct threat, it might not go far. Still, they were clearly unsettled. We didn't sleep much that night. The office offered to let us all stay in the main building if we wanted, but we decided to stick together in cabin 2. We locked the doors, closed the blinds, and stayed awake most of the night listening for sounds. Every creak, every gust of wind felt like something more. The next morning, we packed up early. The mood was dead quiet. No one made jokes. No one said much at all. We handed in the keys and left. A few weeks later, one of my friends called to say the police had followed up. They'd found a small camera buried near the edge of the woods behind cabin 3. It was covered in leaves and wrapped in a plastic bag. It had a memory card full of photos, mostly of us, and a few others dated weeks before we arrived. Different people, different groups. It looked like someone had been living out there, quietly watching whoever came to stay. No one ever figured out who it was. I think about that sometimes, about how close they must have been, how many times they probably passed right behind us while we were laughing, drinking, sleeping. We had gone out there to catch up, to relax, to feel free. And the whole time, someone had been watching us from the dark. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures. A single-story wood-paneled structure tucked into a pocket of trees, about 20 minutes from the nearest town. The listing promised total privacy, no neighbors, no interruptions. That's what I was after. A few days alone to work on my manuscript, without traffic noise or people knocking or deliveries or anything else to pull me away from it. The drive up was peaceful. No streetlights once I turned off the highway, just gravel roads and forest. I kept checking my GPS to make sure I was still on the right track. Eventually, the trees parted and the cabin came into view. It looked clean and well kept. There was a small deck out front with 2 chairs and a table. The key was in a lockbox, just like the host had said. Inside, everything was simple but nice. Open floor plan, kitchen and living area together, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom. It smelled like cedar and something faintly sweet, maybe a candle. I unpacked a few things and made myself coffee. There was no TV, just a Bluetooth speaker, a bookshelf with some older paperbacks, and a wood burning stove in the corner. I turned off my phone and put it in a drawer. That first afternoon, I settled in. Started outlining a chapter I've been struggling with for weeks. The silence helped me focus. There was no hum of appliances, no traffic outside, just birds and the wind in the trees. Around sunset, I took a short walk on the narrow dirt path that led deeper into the woods behind the cabin. The trees thickened quickly, and after a few minutes I turned back. I wanted to get inside before it got too dark. Back at the cabin, I heated up some soup and read for a while. I didn't notice the door until the next morning. It was set into the foundation around the back of the cabin. I saw it when I went outside to drink my coffee and walk around the property. The cabin was built on a slight slope, so the rear wall was higher off the ground than the front. Tucked beneath it, almost hidden behind some overgrown shrubs, was a heavy-looking metal door with a handle and a padlock. It wasn't mentioned in the listing. I crouched down to get a better look. The concrete around the door looked older, a little cracked, but the lock was shiny and clean. No rust. It looked brand new. I tried the handle. Locked tight. I went back inside and sent the host a message. I kept it short. Hey, I noticed a locked basement door around back. Just curious if that's used or occupied. He responded about an hour later. Said, no, just storage down there. Locked up. Nothing to worry about. It sounded fine. I let it go. That night, I stayed up late writing. The quiet helped. I was finally getting words down without forcing them. Around 11:30, I made tea and sat by the window to relax before going to bed. I heard something, a creak. At first I thought it was the wind, or maybe an animal stepping on the deck. I turned off the lights and looked outside. The trees were still, and the deck was empty. Then I heard it again. Not above, below. Creaking floorboards, but muffled. From underneath. I turned and stared at the wooden floor beneath my feet. I stood still and listened. There was again, slow, heavy footsteps. Not constant. Just a few steps, then silence. Then a few more. The kind of sound a person makes when they're trying not to be heard. I didn't move for a long time. I just stood in the middle of the room and waited. Eventually the sound stopped. I told myself it must have been something shifting in the basement. Maybe the house settling. I tried to sleep, but every time the floor creaked or the wind pushed against the window, I felt that tightness in my chest come back. The next morning, I went outside. I walked straight to the basement door. It was still locked, but I noticed something different. The padlock. It wasn't the same one I'd seen the day before. The other one was new and shiny. This one was different. Still new, but a different color. And the brand was different. I knew because I'd looked at the old one pretty closely when I first found the door. This wasn't the same. That didn't sit right with me. I hadn't heard anyone drive up. No vehicles. No footsteps outside. But someone had been there. Someone had changed the lock. I packed my things quickly. I didn't stop to eat or shower. I tossed everything into my duffel and left a short note on the kitchen counter telling the host I was checking out early. I drove back to the highway without looking back. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out from behind the trees. Nothing. When I got home, I called Airbnb. I told them what happened. I tried to keep my voice calm and just explain what I saw, what I heard. They took it seriously. A few days later, I got a message from someone in their trust and safety department. They said the host had previously rented out the basement space without disclosing it in the listing. Off-platform, they called it, meaning he'd let people stay down there without going through Airbnb's system. No verification, no background checks, just cash deals, probably. They wouldn't tell me who had been staying down there or if someone had been there the same time I was. But they said the listing had been removed and the host was being investigated. I still think about the footsteps, the way they moved. Slow, careful, like the person knew someone was upstairs, like they were waiting for something. I'm not sure I'll ever rent a standalone place again. Not without checking every inch of it first. Not unless I can see every room, every door. Because if someone was down there, someone the host didn't tell me about, I don't know what they wanted. But I know what it felt like. It felt like they were listening, watching, waiting for the right moment. And if I hadn't heard those steps when I did, I try not to finish that thought. It was late October when I decided to rent a cabin for a week up in the Appalachian foothills. I've been feeling burnout from work and wanted a full break from everything. People, phone calls, notifications, traffic. I found a small place listed on a regional rental site. It wasn't on Airbnb or anything big. The listing was basic, but it had a few pictures of a dark wooden cabin tucked into a clearing, surrounded by trees starting to turn orange and red. It looked isolated and quiet. Exactly what I needed. I drove up early on a Monday. The route took me deeper and deeper into the woods. I passed fewer houses the farther I went. Eventually, I turned onto a gravel road that climbed for what felt like forever. The forest got thick on either side. My tires kicked up dust and pine needles as I climbed the final half mile to the cabin. When I pulled in, it looked just like the pictures, maybe even better in person. There was a small porch with a bench swing and a set of wooden stairs that creaked when I stepped on them. The key had been left under a flat rock next to the steps, just like the owner said. Inside, it was simple but nice. A wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen, one bedroom, a bathroom with running water, and big windows that looked out over the woods. There was no TV, no internet, and barely a signal on my phone. I turned it off and stuck in a drawer. The first couple of days were uneventful. I cooked simple meals, read books, took naps, went for hikes along the nearby trails. I even tried sketching for a bit. The weather was cool but not cold, and the silence was deep. No cars, no voices, just the wind and rustling leaves. On the third day, I decided to follow a trail that started behind the cabin. It wasn't marked on any of the printed maps the owner had left, but I figured it might loop around. I packed a thermos, snacks, and a flashlight just in case. The trail was narrow and covered in fallen leaves. It dipped and rose through the hills, and after about 40 minutes, I realized I hadn't seen any kind of marker or sign in a while. I looked behind me and saw no clear path, just leaves and brush. I didn't panic, but it unsettled me. I kept moving forward, hoping it would loop back or meet another trail. Eventually, I stumbled across what looked like an old hunting shack. It was smaller than the cabin, weathered and partly collapsed on one side. A rusted metal drum stood outside, and old tools were scattered around. I thought about checking inside, but something about it just made my skin crawl. The door was half hanging off, and the windows were covered in grime. I decided to keep moving. After another 20 minutes, I spotted a clearing and then a slope I recognized. I made it back near the cabin, just came at it from a different angle. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept thinking about that old shack. Something about it bothered me. It wasn't just the decay. It was the feeling that someone had used it recently. The ground around it had been clear of leaves, like they'd been swept or walked over repeatedly. There was also a dented can of beans near the door that looked newer than the rest of the trash. The next morning, I hiked back to the spot, half convinced I'd imagined the feeling. When I got there, the can of beans was gone. I stood in front of the shack for a while listening. The woods were still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't go inside. I turned and headed back. That night, I double-checked the locks. The cabin had a thick bolt on the front door and a simple latch on the back. I shut all the curtains, even though no one was around for miles. Or at least, that's what I thought. I fell asleep around 10. Sometime later, maybe 1 or 2 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of movement outside. Not animals. Heavier. Steadier. Footsteps. I sat up, heart pounding. I didn't move for a long time, just listened. They came from the side of the house, slow and deliberate. Then nothing. Just silence again. Eventually, I talked myself into thinking it was probably a deer or maybe just my imagination, and I managed to fall asleep again, but it wasn't restful. The next day, I circled the cabin looking for tracks. The ground was soft from a recent rain. On the side near the kitchen window, I found what looked like a partial shoe print. Not a boot, more like a sneaker. Too big to be mine. I wear size 9. This was at least a size 12, maybe more. The print pointed toward the woods. I spent most of that day inside. I read, but couldn't concentrate. Every sound outside caught my attention. Squirrels in the leaves. Wind brushing branches. I kept looking out the windows. Around dusk, I heard something again, closer this time. Snapping twigs, heavier than any animal I'd heard before. I didn't go out. I didn't even move. I just waited until it got fully dark and then locked everything down again. That night, I didn't sleep well. Around 3 in the morning, I thought I heard the front porch creak. Just once, then silence. When the sun came up, I opened the door and saw something that froze me in place. On the porch railing, near the swing, sat a used match. Just one. It hadn't been there before. I don't smoke. I hadn't used any matches. And it hadn't rained that night. It would have been washed away if it had been sitting there before. Someone had been on the porch. Close. Watching, maybe. That was the last straw. I didn't care if it was just a weird local or some drifter. I packed my things in a rush and threw everything in the back of my car. I started driving down the gravel road, faster than I should have, bouncing over potholes and skidding on wet leaves. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone standing in the trees. But no one was there. When I got to the nearest town, I pulled into the gas station and used their Wi-Fi to call the cabin owner. I told him what happened, every detail. He didn't say much, just said no one should have been up there. Said he'd go check it out himself. I never heard back from him. I didn't follow up. A week later, I looked up the area again. Out of curiosity, the cabin listing was gone. Not just taken down, completely wiped from the rental site. The old shack wasn't on any maps. There was no mention of it online, and I didn't find anything about missing persons or recent arrests in the area. I don't know who was out there. Maybe someone squatting. Maybe someone who thought I was trespassing. Maybe someone who just liked watching. I don't rent remote places anymore. I don't hike alone. And if I ever hear footsteps outside in the dark again, I won't wait to find out who they belong to. I booked a last-minute rental cabin in the Catskills because I needed to get out of the city. My head had been a mess. Too much noise, too many screens, too many people. I wanted quiet, just a few days to myself. I found a small place listed online. The photos looked decent. Not fancy, just a single-level wooden cabin tucked into the trees, a little porch, one bedroom, and a fireplace. It was available for that weekend. I booked it late Friday night, packed a duffel, and left early the next morning. The drive up was peaceful. The farther I got from the city, the better I felt. The air changed. Trees thickened. The roads narrowed. It was almost sunset when I reached the gravel driveway. The host had texted me earlier, keys under the mat. I parked next to the cabin, stepped out, and stretched. The place looked just like the pictures, but more isolated than I expected. There were no other cabins nearby, just woods on all sides, and the last mile of the road was more of a dirt path than anything else. I walked up the steps, lifted the mat, and found the key. It turned easily in the lock. I stepped inside and immediately noticed something strange. It was warm, not just stale, like a place that had been closed up. The air was warm, the kind of warmth you feel when someone's just been in a room and left. I paused at the doorway, holding my bag, listening. Nothing, just the faint creak of the porch cooling behind me. Inside, it was clean, a little too clean. The throw blanket was folded perfectly on the couch. The coffee table had a few coasters lined up. The bed was made with tight hospital corners. It looked staged. I walked through the space slowly. The layout was simple. A small living room, a galley kitchen to the left, a hallway that led to the bathroom and bedroom. Everything in place. Nothing obviously out of order. But then I noticed a duffel bag behind the couch. I stopped. It hadn't been in the listing photos. It looked lived in, like someone had dropped it there not long ago. The zipper was open a little. I bent down and unzipped it fully. Inside were clothes, socks, a pack of cigarettes, a toothbrush, and a wallet. The wallet had a driver's license, some guy named Warren. I didn't recognize the face. I stood up fast. My body went tense. I looked around the room again, now with different eyes. The air wasn't just warm. It felt occupied. I walked quietly to the kitchen and grabbed a heavy mug, just in case. I called out, but my voice sounded thin in the room. No answer. I opened the bedroom door quickly. Empty. Closet was empty too. I checked the bathroom. Nothing. The place was quiet. Too quiet. Then I heard footsteps on the porch. Heavy. Slow. I froze. The front door creaked open. I hadn't locked it. A man stepped in, tall, maybe late 30s. He stopped mid-step when he saw me. We both stared. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. Then I said, "I rented this place." He didn't move, just stared at me. Then he finally said, So did I. I watched his hands. They weren't carrying anything. He didn't look aggressive, more confused than anything. We both pulled out our phones. Sure enough, we each had separate confirmation emails, same weekend, same check-in time. I showed him mine. He showed me his. Both legit. Same host name, same address. I felt something drop in my stomach. The host had double booked. He didn't seem angry, but he didn't move from the doorway either. I said, "It's fine. I'll go find a motel or something," and started walking toward the bedroom to grab my bag. That's when he said something that made everything shift. He said, "I've been watching you since you got out of your car." I stopped. I didn't turn around right away. I just stared at the wall in front of me. I hadn't seen anyone when I arrived. No cars on the road. No movement in the trees. Nothing. I turned slowly. He was still standing in the doorway, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at me like he hadn't said anything odd at all. I took a step back, then another. I walked into the bathroom, locked the door, and held my breath. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I opened the small frosted window above the tub. It was a tight fit, but I didn't think twice. I tossed my phone out onto the grass, then climbed out myself, scraping my forearm in the process. My foot caught the windowsill, and I almost fell, but I landed hard and rolled, got up, grabbed my phone, and ran. I didn't stop running for at least a mile. The woods were closing in. No reception. My lungs burned, and I could taste blood in my mouth from breathing so hard, but I didn't stop until I hit the main road. I kept walking, sticking close to the shoulder, checking my phone every few steps until I finally got a single bar. I called 911 and gave them the address from my confirmation email. Told them everything about the double booking, the duffel bag, the man's comment. They said they'd send someone. A sheriff's deputy met me about half an hour later. His cruiser pulled up and I flagged him down. I told him again what happened, more calmly this time. He took notes, asked me to wait in the car while he drove up to the cabin. When he came back about 40 minutes later, he looked puzzled. The place was empty, he said. No sign of the guy you described. No bag behind the couch either. He let me sit in the cruiser while he filed the report. I asked what would happen next. He said they'd try to contact the host, find out what went wrong with the booking. But if the guy was gone and there was no sign of forced entry or violence, there wasn't much they could do. I ended up getting a cheap motel in the next town over. Slept with the light on. The next morning, I checked the rental listing again. It had been taken down, not marked as unavailable. Asterisk completely removed. Asterisk host profile too. I sent an email to the booking site. They replied a day later saying the listing had been deactivated due to a violation of terms, but they wouldn't tell me what that meant. I got a refund, but no answers. I kept thinking about what the man said, that he'd been watching me since I got out of my car. If he had been, then where was he? I hadn't seen a second vehicle. There were no other tire tracks in the gravel. And if he'd gotten there before me, why was the key still under the mat? The wallet in the bag. I remember the name on the license. I tried looking it up later, public records, social media. Nothing came up. It was like he didn't exist. Sometimes I wonder if he planned to wait until dark. If I hadn't locked that bathroom door. If I'd stayed the night thinking it was just a mistake. I don't book remote cabins anymore, even if they look perfect, especially if they look perfect. I rented a remote backcountry camping spot through an online reservation system. It was in Colorado, somewhere out near the San Juan Mountains. Not totally off the grid, but far enough out that you had to park at a small trailhead and hike in about 2 miles. The site itself wasn't even marked on the main trails. The description said it was a designated solo clearing meant for experienced campers who wanted isolation. That was exactly what I wanted. I'd taken a few solo trips before, but this was supposed to be the quietest one yet. Just me, a tent, and the woods. I drove in early that morning. The dirt road to the trailhead was rough and narrow. My phone had already lost signal about 10 minutes before I reached the parking area, which didn't surprise me. Just a small gravel turnout with a wooden post and a trail register box. I signed my name and the date, threw on my pack, and started hiking. The forest felt empty in a good way at first. Just me and the sound of wind in the trees, birds chirping, and the occasional rustle in the brush. The hike wasn't hard. mostly flat with some gentle uphill near the end. I followed the directions on my printed permit, counting trail markers, then took a narrow, barely there path off to the right. After a few more minutes of climbing over some down trees and pushing through dense undergrowth, I reached the clearing. It was a nice spot, a flat open patch with soft pine needles underfoot and a little ring of rocks where someone had built a fire pit. Trees surrounded it on all sides, but they weren't packed too close, just enough to offer privacy. The sun filtered in through the branches, lighting the place in patches. There was even a big fallen log that made a perfect bench. I took off my pack and walked a slow circle around the clearing. That's when I saw the tent. It was already set up, about 15 feet from the fire pit. A blue dome-style tent. Looked like it had been pitched recently. Not dirty or collapsed. The rain fly was still on, and the stakes were clean, no signs of heavy weather. I stood there staring at it for a while, confused. I was the only one booked for this site. I was sure of it. I pulled out the printed permit from my pack and checked the date and the name. Everything matched. I figured I might have made a mistake, maybe misread the location or something. So I decided to hike back up to a higher ridge where I'd passed a small outcropping earlier that had a partial view of the valley below. I remembered that sometimes you could get signal if you were high enough. It took me about 25 minutes to get there. I held my phone up and waited. Eventually, a single bar flickered in and out. I refreshed the reservation page. My name was still the only one listed for that night. No other bookings. No errors. It was just me. I stood there for a long time trying to think it through. Maybe someone had snuck in without a permit. Maybe it was a hunter using the spot or someone who had gotten lost and just set up camp. Still, it didn't sit right with me. When I got back to the clearing, the tent was still there. Same position, same shape, but now the front door was unzipped halfway. I stopped walking and stared at it. The tent flap moved slightly in the breeze, but no one came out. I walked closer, slowly. When I peeked inside, I felt this weird wave of discomfort hit me. The tent was completely empty. No sleeping bag, no backpack, no food, clothes, gear, nothing. Just the bare floor of the tent and the mesh windows on the sides. It looked like someone had set it up and never actually used it. I backed away and stood near my own pack, unsure of what to do. I thought about leaving right then, just hiking out and driving back to town. But it was already getting late in the afternoon, and I didn't want to be on that narrow road after dark. I decided to stay just for the night. I set up my tent a good 50 feet away near the opposite edge of the clearing. I kept my headlamp around my neck, set up a small fire, and cooked dinner quietly. As the sun dipped behind the trees, everything started to feel heavier. I kept glancing at the blue tent. It just sat there, still and open. No movement. I waited for someone to show up. Nobody came. By the time it was dark, I'd already put out the fire and zipped myself into my tent. I didn't sleep much. Every twig snap outside made me flinch. I kept imagining someone creeping around silently. I had my headlamp on all night, just resting on my chest. Every so often, I clicked it on and scanned the tent walls for shadows. Nothing ever happened, but I didn't sleep more than a few minutes at a time. When the sky finally started to lighten, I got up. The air was cold and damp. I walked straight over to the blue tent, not really sure what I expected. But as soon as I looked inside, my stomach dropped. There was something in it now. Right in the center of the floor was a folded piece of white paper. Clean, no dirt on it, like it had just been placed there. I crouched down and picked it up with shaking hands. In block letters, written with what looked like a thick black marker, were the words, "You shouldn't have come here alone." No name, no other message. Just that. I felt a cold wave wash over me. I stood up, turning in circles, scanning the woods. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything. Just the sound of wind through the trees and the distant calls of birds. But I knew someone had been here. Someone had to have walked into that tent in the middle of the night and left that note. I didn't pack up properly. I shoved everything into my pack as fast as I could. Tent, stove, food, jammed it all in without folding or wrapping anything. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire time. I left the fire pit cold and scattered and didn't stop moving until I reached the main trail. I didn't pause to rest. I didn't eat. I didn't drink water until it was back in my car. When I finally reached the lot, my car was the only one there. Just like when I arrived, I checked the trail register again. Only my name. No one else had signed in for that site. I drove straight into town. I didn't even stop for gas until I was half an hour away. When I finally did, I sat in the parking lot of a gas station and stared at the note. I'd stuffed it into my jacket pocket without even thinking. It was still folded the same way. I kept wondering how someone could have gotten that close to me without making a sound. How they got inside the tent and left something without waking me up. I didn't report it. I didn't go to the ranger station. I didn't tell anyone for a while. What would I even say? There wasn't a crime. There wasn't a confrontation. Just a tent, a note, and someone who knew I was alone. But I've never gone solo camping since, and I never will again. We got to the state park a little before sunset. It was early fall, one of those cool days where the sun feels warm, but the shade reminds you that summer's over. The air smelled like dried leaves and dirt, and the trees were already turning yellow and orange. I was with my girlfriend at the time, Jen, and my roommate, Mark. The three of us had been camping a bunch of times before, so we didn't think much of doing a spontaneous overnight trip. We just packed some sloppy Joe mix, a couple of sleeping bags, and a tent, and drove the hour or so out from the city. We were setting up the tent when a big black dog came bursting out of the tree line, moving fast and low like it was chasing something. At first I froze, thinking it was a coyote or a stray, but when it got closer we saw the collar and tags. Its tongue was hanging out and it seemed friendly enough, just overexcited. We managed to calm it down and walked it over to the next campsite, about 30 yards down the dirt path from ours. There was a couple there, probably late 20s or early 30s, and they thanked us when we returned the dog. They didn't seem weird, just your average weekend campers. The guy was tall and wore a Carhartt hoodie, and the woman had a big knit beanie and one of those enamel mugs in her hand. They said they hadn't realized the dog had run off. We chatted for a second, then went back to our site to finish setting up. I didn't really think about them again after that. By the time the fire was going and the sloppy joes were bubbling in a pot, the sun was down and the sky had gone black. The campground wasn't completely full, but there were a few other tents scattered off in the distance. The woods around us were quiet except for the occasional owl or squirrel. Jen was stirring the pot while Mark and I sat on logs, talking about nothing important. Then I noticed a light flashing at us. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a steady flick on, flick off, flick on again. At first I thought maybe someone was signaling their dog or messing around with a flashlight. I watched for a few seconds, then nudged Jen and said, "They're flashing a light over here." She didn't even look, just said, "Ignore it, probably nothing." But they kept doing it. Every few seconds, a quick flash, sometimes brighter, sometimes dimmer. I started to feel irritated more than anything. It had been going on for 15 minutes now, long enough to seem intentional. Mark noticed it too, but shrugged it off. We finally finished eating, packed the food away, and dumped water on the fire until it was just glowing coals. That's when I heard them coming down the path. Crunching leaves, footsteps in the gravel, voices talking, too loud for how late it was. I checked my watch. It was 12:34. Quiet hours at the park started at 10. They were walking slowly, both with headlamps on, moving in sync like they were in a parade. But what really caught me was the way the woman was talking. Not a normal conversation. She was narrating something like reading a script or writing out loud. "Dear Diary," I heard her say clearly. My stomach dropped a little. I remember that exact moment, because Jen had frozen with the pot lid still in her hand, and Mark had stood up slightly like he wasn't sure if he should greet them or not. They kept walking until they were about 15 yards away from us. Then they just stopped, didn't say anything, just stood there, staring. The headlamps made it hard to see their faces, but the beams were pointed near us. I looked at Mark. He looked at me. It felt like 5 minutes passed, though I know it wasn't more than 10 seconds. Mark finally called out, "Hello." They didn't move for a second. Then the woman said in this strange, flat tone, "It seems they've extinguished their fire." We hadn't. The coals were still glowing orange behind us. Then they turned and walked back to their campsite. Not a word more. I couldn't shake the way she said that. It sounded wrong, like she was reading lines from a play, or like she was saying it for someone else, someone who wasn't there. Jen tried to brush it off and kept saying they were just weird or high or something. Mark didn't say much at all. just kept staring down the path toward their site. We got ready for bed not long after. It was cold enough that you could see your breath. We crawled into the tent, zipped up the sleeping bags, and I turned off the lantern. The tent had mesh sides, and from where I was lying, I could see out toward the other side if I looked sideways. I remember turning to face that way, just casually glancing out as my eyes adjusted to the dark. That's when I saw them again. They were crawling, on all fours, both of them, slowly through the leaves and dirt, heading toward our tent. Their headlamps were off now, and they moved almost silently, like they were trying not to break twigs. My mind went blank. For a second, I couldn't even process what I was looking at. It didn't make sense. They crawled forward side by side, moving in short bursts like animals stalking something. I whispered Jen's name, but I didn't want to make any noise. She didn't respond. I looked at Mark in the dark, and his eyes were wide open. Then, without any warning or sound, they stopped, stayed still for a few seconds, then turned around and crawled away, back toward their campsite. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I just laid there, waiting for sounds, waiting for the zipper to move, for footsteps, for anything. But nothing else happened. The night was quiet after that. Too quiet, honestly. In the morning, we packed up fast. None of us wanted to stay longer than we had to. The couple walked by us around 8 a.m., fully packed, dog trotting along on a leash. The guy gave a nod and said, "Morning." The woman smiled like nothing had happened, like they hadn't stood staring at us, hadn't crawled toward our tent in the middle of the night. I couldn't even think of a way to respond. Just stared at them as they disappeared down the road. We didn't report it. What would we say? That a couple was acting weird? Crawling around at night isn't a crime. And honestly, I didn't want to deal with it. I just wanted to leave. We didn't camp again for a long time after that. Mark never talks about it. If I bring it up, he just shrugs like it didn't matter. Jen and I broke up about 6 months later, not because of that night, but I've wondered if maybe it stuck with her the same way it did with me. Even now, years later, every time I go camping, if I go, I find myself staring off into the woods once it gets dark, wondering if someone's out there low to the ground, watching, waiting, pretending to be something they're not. I worked at Boy Scout summer camp in 2015. The whole summer, I lived in one of the nicer canvas tents they had set up for staff. Wooden platform floor, 2 cots, electrical outlet, and a fan that barely helped in the heat. I've been there all season, and by August, things were winding down. The older scouts had mostly rotated out, and the camp had this kind of tired, quiet rhythm to it. You get used to a place like that, used to the sounds of nature at night, the wind in the trees, the animals moving through the underbrush. And if you're there long enough, you stop being scared of the dark. We even prided ourselves on that. No flashlights at night. Use your night vision was kind of a badge of honor for staff. We joked about it, but we stuck to it. Eyes adjust, and the woods feel different when you're not lighting them up like a Christmas tree. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. It had been raining for hours hard. Not a drizzle, but one of those heavy, steady downpours where you can hear every drop hitting the canvas above your head. The wind was coming in strong gusts, shaking the tent walls, and I could hear the trees creaking and swaying outside. It wasn't a thunderstorm, just wind and rain. A storm that sat on top of us and refused to move. My cot was a little damp, either from the humidity or maybe a leak somewhere along the seams. I wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but when I woke up, I realized I had to pee bad. The kind of pressure that makes it impossible to fall back asleep. Now, the staff tents were in a clearing tucked maybe 200 yards away from the main bathroom. The path wasn't paved, just a dirt trail worn into the grass and mud, winding through patches of trees and brush. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about walking it at night, but in the middle of that storm, I didn't feel like getting soaked just to use a bathroom, so I figured I'd just go in the woods. I pulled on a raincoat over my boxers and a pair of socks and stepped out into the wet. The rain hit me right away, cold and heavy, slapping against my hood. The wind was cutting, not freezing, but enough to make you grit your teeth. The trees around the tent groaned with the force of the gusts, branches swaying and leaves tearing loose and flying. I remember taking a deep breath and muttering to myself, just trying to hurry up and get it over with so I could crawl back under my sleeping bag. I stepped off the path and walked maybe 10 feet into the tree line. I couldn't see much, but I didn't need to. After a whole summer in that camp, my body had mapped the woods well enough to move without a flashlight. The sky was completely overcast, no moonlight, no stars, just that thick, dark gray mass hanging overhead. Everything felt tight and muffled. The rain seemed to soak sound as much as it did anything else. I picked a tree, turned my back to the camp, and started peeing. It was one of those strangely peaceful moments despite the storm. Just me, the sound of water hitting bark and leaves, and the wind howling high above. I remember thinking about how weird it was that I could still smell pine and wet soil, even with the rain. It was oddly grounding. Then just as I finished and zipped up, I heard something. It wasn't the wind. It was a sudden, sharp crack, not a twig underfoot or an animal moving. This was higher, up in the canopy, the kind of sound that cuts straight through everything. My body reacted before I even thought about it. I flinched and then launched myself to the side, arms out, feet slipping in the mud. I scrambled blindly, maybe 20 feet from where I'd been standing, heart hammering in my ears. And then it came down. The sound was massive. Not an explosion exactly, but a violent crash that shook the ground. Something had fallen, heavy and fast, and landed right where I'd been a few seconds before. I laid there in the wet brush, chest heaving, my whole body buzzing. I could feel the cold of the mud soaking into my clothes and the sting of a scrape on my shin from where I caught a branch or rock. For a few seconds, I didn't move. I just stared out into the dark, trying to make sense of what happened. I couldn't see anything, just a vague outline of trees and shadows. I sat up, wiped water from my face, and fumbled for my phone. Screw night vision. I pulled it out of my raincoat pocket, unlocked it with wet fingers, and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark and lit up the spot I had just been standing. Right there, half sunk in the mud and surrounded by shattered bark and leaves, was a giant tree limb. Easily 10, maybe 15 feet long, thick as a telephone pole at the base. The end had snapped off jagged where it had broken from the tree, and the rest of it was gnarled and twisted with smaller limbs and moss clinging to it. It looked old, dead for a long time. A widowmaker, that's what we call them. Those heavy, dead branches that hang in the canopy until the wind brings them down, often without warning. The kind of thing that can kill you in an instant. If I hadn't moved, if I'd stood there another 5 seconds longer, it would have crushed me. There was no question about that. I stood there shaking, just staring at it, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. The thought that kept running through my head wasn't panic. It was this cold, creeping realization of how fast it could have ended. No sound, no warning, no nothing. Just lights out. I looked up at the tree above it, and I could barely see where the limb had come from. The whole canopy was shifting in the wind, other branches swaying, some dead, some not. I took a few steps back, scanning the area, feeling completely exposed all of a sudden. Those woods I'd walked through all summer felt like a different place. Not alive, not threatening, just indifferent, uncaring. Like nature didn't even register that I existed. That kind of thing doesn't haunt you with fear, it humbles you. I turned and walked quickly back toward the tent. The rain hadn't let up, and now I felt every drop like a needle against my skin. I didn't even try to shake off before crawling back inside. I stripped off my wet clothes, wrapped myself in a towel, and sat on my cot, staring at the tent wall. I couldn't fall asleep for a while. Every time the wind picked up and I heard a crack or creak outside, my whole body tensed up. I kept picturing that limb, lying there in the mud like a warning. After that night, I started using a flashlight. Every single time. I didn't care if people joked or said anything. That summer had taught me a lot about the outdoors, but that moment drove something home in a way that no training or experience ever could. It's not the dark that gets you. It's the things that can happen when you stop respecting what's around you. I was lucky. A few seconds later, and someone would have found me out there in the woods, half buried under a limb I never even saw coming. That's not some story to scare people. It's just how fast things can change. That branch stayed out there the rest of the week until cleanup. I made a point to show a few of the newer staff, especially the ones still bragging about not needing flashlights. Some of them got quiet. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. It was right there in the mud. Proof enough. After camp ended, I went back home, back to regular life. But I've never forgotten that night. It comes back to me sometimes, usually when I'm walking through woods alone or when I hear wind tearing through trees in the middle of the night. It's not fear, not really. It's just memory and respect and that uneasy reminder that even when you think you know a place, it doesn't mean it won't try to kill you. I went hiking with my cousin Dan in a lesser-known part of forest in Oregon. It was one of those unmarked trails he'd found through some old forum post, just GPS coordinates and a vague description. The area wasn't on most maps, just a stretch of green between two fire roads and a lot of nothing in between. Dan liked that kind of thing. He was always looking for places that felt untouched. I went along because I liked the quiet and I figured it would be a decent break from work. We parked on a small pull-off beside a dirt road and started hiking early, around 8 a.m. It was the kind of forest that felt heavy, not because of weather or anything, just quiet. No wind, barely any birds. Even the bugs were weirdly absent. We figured maybe it had rained recently, or maybe the elevation was throwing things off. But we kept going. After about 6 miles, the trail got harder to follow. It narrowed and twisted, and the trees started growing closer together. We stopped for a bit on a ridge and had some snacks, then decided to drop down into a valley where the trees looked thinner. That's when we saw the campsite. It wasn't like someone had just thrown a tent up and built a fire ring. It looked like someone had lived there for a while. There were tarps strung between trees, rope lines for drying stuff, a couple of folding chairs, one of them broken, and a heavy-duty plastic table with signs of old food stains. Everything was faded and dirty, but the weird part was how nothing looked overgrown. No moss on the surfaces, no buildup of leaves. It hadn't been abandoned for long, probably a week or two at most, but there were no signs of person. No clothes, no boots, no backpack, no sleeping bag, just the things they used. It was like they got up one morning and walked away without taking anything. Dan checked out the tarps and found a small stash of canned food tucked into a crate. No labels on most of them, but they weren't rusted, which meant they were fairly new. A rusted propane tank sat upright beside a stone fire ring, but it was clearly empty. The top was corroded and stained, like it had been leaking for a while. In the center of the site was a heavy-duty white cooler with a thick padlock on it, the kind you'd use for hauling meat or ice on a long trip. It was scuffed and dusty but intact. We both kind of stood around it for a bit, not really saying anything, just looking. Something about it felt off, like the whole site had been arranged around it. There were scratch marks in the dirt nearby, like someone had dragged it into place and left it there. Dan walked a circle around it, maybe thinking he'd find a key somewhere, but I didn't want to touch anything. The whole camp felt wrong, not like someone dangerous had been there, just like it wasn't meant to be seen, like we were somewhere we weren't supposed to be. After a few more minutes, we decided to leave it alone and keep hiking. It was getting late in the afternoon anyway, and we wanted to set up our own camp before it got dark. We hiked another 2 miles and found a small clearing near a slope that overlooked a dry creek bed. We pitched our tent side by side, built a small fire, and made some simple food. Neither of us talked much that evening. I think we were both still thinking about that site. It wasn't terrifying exactly, just uncomfortable. You could feel it under your skin. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to sound paranoid. Around midnight, I woke up. At first, I thought it was just a dream. I had that half-awake feeling, like I'd been startled by something, but couldn't tell what. I lay still, eyes open in the dark, trying to listen. And that's when I heard it, an engine. Low, steady, not moving, just idling. It sounded maybe 50 yards away, maybe closer. There were no drivable paths near us. Nothing on a GPS. We were deep in the woods. That sound made no sense. I didn't move. I didn't unzip my tent. I just lay there, frozen, listening to the soft hum of it. It didn't rev, didn't fade. Just kept humming low and steady. I could hear Dan shift in his tent. He was awake too. I knew he heard it. We didn't say anything. Neither of us wanted to speak, not even in whispers. After a few minutes, maybe 5, maybe 15, the sound stopped. Like someone had turned a key. Silence dropped back into the trees. That silence was somehow worse. I didn't sleep much after that. Just lay there, ears straining, heart beating fast for what felt like hours. Dan didn't make a sound. We both stayed in our tents until morning. When it was light enough to see, we packed up fast. No breakfast, no sitting around. Just grabbed our gear and headed straight back toward the old camp. I don't even know why. Curiosity, probably, or maybe just the need to know we hadn't imagined any of it. It took us a bit to find the place again, but when we did, we both stopped cold. It was gone. Every tarp, every rope, the table, the chairs vanished. Even the fire ring had been kicked apart, scattered like someone didn't want it to be found. But the strangest thing was the spot where the cooler had been. The dirt was fresh, like it had been raked or disturbed in the night. And right there in the center, scratched into the soil with what looked like a stick, were the words. "Don't open it." The letters weren't neat. They looked hurried, desperate. Some lines were deeper than others, like whoever wrote it had been shaking. We just stood there staring. The prints around it were a mess. Drag marks, indentations, maybe tire tracks. I couldn't be sure, but it looked like someone had used a cart or something to haul everything away. That was enough for us. We didn't talk about checking the area again. We didn't take photos. We just turned around and hiked out as fast as we could. We barely stopped for water. The way out felt longer than it had the day before. Every now and then I thought I heard something behind us, twigs snapping, faint movement, but I didn't look back. I didn't want to see anything. I just wanted out. We got back to the car by late afternoon. Everything was still there, no signs of anyone else. We didn't talk much on the drive back. Dan dropped me off at home, and I didn't hear from him for a few days. When we finally did talk, we agreed not to tell anyone else. Not because we were scared of being believed, but because we couldn't explain it. Who would set up a full camp, then haul it out overnight without a trace? Who was out there with a vehicle deep in the woods? And what the hell was in that cooler? I still think about it sometimes, especially the sound of that engine. The way it just sat there in the dark, not moving like someone was waiting, watching. We never went back, never tried to find that trail again. Whatever was out there, it didn't want to be found. And whatever was in that cooler, I'm just glad we left it locked. I rented a cabin deep in the mountains of West Virginia for a long weekend. It was one of those listings that looked just rustic enough to feel like an escape, but still had running water, power, and decent cell reception if I stood on the porch. I booked it last minute, needed a break from the city, from people, from everything. The listing said secluded, and it meant it. No other houses around, just thick woods all around, tall trees packed together, so tight they looked like walls when the sun started to go down. The cabin itself was small. One floor, open kitchen and living room area, and a bedroom with a full-size bed that faced a wide window looking out into the trees. The place was clean, nothing fancy. The host didn't leave a welcome basket or anything, just a little laminated sheet on the table with a Wi-Fi password and checkout instructions. First thing I noticed when I stepped outside to look around was that there were a lot of trail cams. At least 6 of them, all strapped to trees at different angles. Some pointed toward the trails, some toward the cabin itself. They looked like regular motion-activated hunting cams. I figured they were to catch pictures of deer or bears or whatever wandered through. It was West Virginia, probably common. The host hadn't mentioned them in the listing, but it didn't seem like a big deal at first. I spent most of the first day hiking around, trying to get used to the quiet. It's the kind of silence that isn't really silent. Wind through the trees, leaves rustling, birds calling out every now and then. It was peaceful, but there's something about being that far out that puts you on edge in small ways. You start listening harder, checking over your shoulder more than you mean to. That night, I made a simple dinner, had a beer on the porch, and went to bed early. The bed was surprisingly comfortable. I left the curtains open so I could see the stars, which were bright and clear without city lights. I woke up once during the night, not to a sound, just wide awake. I glanced at the window, stared into the trees for a while. Nothing moved. I eventually drifted back off. The next day was cloudy. I didn't feel like hiking again, so I stayed close. Read for a while, made coffee, walked around the cabin a bit. I kept looking at those trail cams. There was one mounted low on a tree, just a few yards from the bedroom window. It pointed toward the cabin, not the trail. That struck me as odd. I walked up to it, saw the little panel on the bottom where the memory card slot was. Curiosity got the better of me. I flipped it open. No card. I checked another one. Same thing. Then a third, higher up. This one had a card inside. I pulled it out, brought it inside, and plugged it into my laptop. Most of the pictures were exactly what you'd expect. Blurry deer, raccoons, a few shots of fox sniffing around. There are also daytime photos of me walking around, one from the back as I walked down a trail the day before. That felt strange. I hadn't seen any people out here. No one passed by. And these weren't security cams. They were wildlife cameras set far off the trail. But somehow, they picked me up multiple times. Then I saw one photo that stopped me cold. It was inside the cabin. The angle was from about chest height, looking down on the bed. I was in it, face up, blanket pulled to my chest. The timestamp was from the night before, around 2:13 a.m. My face was lit up with the sharp white glow of a flash. Eyes closed. I felt sick. My hands were shaking. I checked every folder on that card, every image, just in case I was wrong. But there was only that one photo taken indoors. I hadn't brought any cameras. There weren't any indoor cams mentioned in the listing. I stood up fast, heart pounding, and started tearing the place apart. I checked under the bed, behind the curtains, inside drawers and cabinets. Eventually, I moved to the living room and looked up. There was a smoke detector near the center of the ceiling, slightly off-colored from the rest of the ceiling paint. I pulled over a chair, climbed up, and twisted it open. Inside was a small black lens, a tiny pinhole camera. I felt the panic really hit then. Not just the weirdness of it, but the fact that someone had been inside while I was asleep. Someone close enough to take that photo with a flash. That wasn't something the hidden cam did. It was a picture taken at eye level, and I hadn't brought anyone with me. I packed everything as fast as I could. Didn't even bother folding clothes or checking to make sure I didn't leave anything. I threw it all in my duffel, ran to the car, and drove straight down the narrow gravel road until I hit the highway. Didn't stop for gas, didn't stop for food. Just kept driving until I saw lights, people, anything. I filed a report with the rental site, sent them the photo, showed them the hidden camera. I didn't have any proof that the host had taken the photo personally, but who else could have? They had the key. No sign of a break-in, nothing was stolen. A few days later, the listing was gone, completely wiped. Host profile deleted too. I never got any kind of follow-up from the platform. Just an auto-generated email thanking me for the report. I gave the police everything I had, but since nothing technically happened, no theft, no injury, they couldn't do much. They took the camera and the trail cam card, said they'd look into it. That was the last I heard from them. I changed my passwords, ran scans on my laptop, even got a new phone just in case. For weeks after, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that flash. That photo of me completely unaware, vulnerable. I didn't even know someone was in the room. The worst part is not knowing who did it. The host. Someone else in the area with access to the property? Was it just me, or were there other guests before me who never found the camera? I haven't stayed in a cabin since. I don't rent Airbnbs anymore either. Even hotels creep me out sometimes. I keep thinking about all those trail cams aimed not at the woods, but at the place I was staying. Watching from all sides, documenting every move. Whoever set them up wasn't looking for deer, and whoever took that picture knew exactly what they were doing. I don't know why, but I've always had this weird sense of comfort when I sleep inside a tent with the rainfly on. I know it doesn't add any real protection, but it makes me feel like I'm not so exposed, like there's a barrier between me and whatever's out there in the dark. That thin layer of fabric just makes things feel safer somehow. But on this trip, my friend convinced me to leave it off. Said it was going to be a clear night and that we'd be able to fall asleep under the stars, which sounded kind of nice at the time. So we left it off. We were backpacking in the Adirondacks, somewhere near the High Peaks region, I think. It was late summer, one of those weekends where the heat breaks just enough to make it tolerable to hike for hours with a loaded pack. We'd hiked maybe 8 or 9 miles that day. Nothing brutal, but enough to make us feel like we earned the views and the rest. We picked a spot a little ways off the main trail, far enough that we wouldn't get any late-night hikers stumbling by, but close enough that we could still follow the worn path back to the main loop the next morning. There was a flat patch of ground with a few big trees nearby, and a small rise just behind us that looked out over a shallow valley. We had good coverage, a small stream about 100 yards away, and enough dry ground to build a little fire. We made dinner just before sundown. Simple stuff, rehydrated noodles, and some trail mix, and sat around for a while, listening to the sounds of the woods settling down. A few birds chirped their last songs for the day. Crickets started up. I remember there were some bugs, but not terrible. The air was cooler than it had been down in the valley, and the wind came in soft waves. It was peaceful. Everything about it felt right. After the fire died down, we both climbed into the tent. We didn't stay up talking or anything. Just kind of turned in, tired from the hike. The lack of the rainfly meant we had a clear view of the sky through the mesh ceiling. I could see stars between the swaying silhouettes of trees. I lay there for a while watching the wind move through the branches, just listening. It was quiet. Not dead quiet, but that kind of calm forest silence that's filled with soft rustling, the occasional snap of a twig, insects, maybe a distant owl. Natural sounds. I started drifting in and out of sleep. I don't know how to explain what happened next. Somewhere in the middle of the night, could have been 1 or 3 or 5 in the morning, I woke up in this half-sleep state. Not fully awake, but not dreaming either, just aware. And in that hazy, groggy state, I had this very vivid feeling. Not a sight or sound exactly, but a feeling, like something massive was moving nearby. I felt the ground shift slightly under me, like distant thuds or vibrations. Deep, heavy footfalls, the kind that roll through the dirt before you actually hear anything. In my head, the image that came up was an elephant. That sounds ridiculous, I know, but it was so clear. I imagined this huge animal lumbering quietly through the woods near our tent. I didn't see it. I didn't hear it breathing or crashing through anything. Just this steady, quiet, ground-shaking movement. For steps, maybe 5. Then nothing. No growl, no howl, not even snapping branches. Just that feeling. I must have fallen back asleep not long after, or maybe I was never fully awake. It's hard to tell when you're in that weird, groggy state where everything blends together. The rest of the night went by without anything else strange happening. I woke up with the sun hitting the side of the tent, and I could hear birds again and my friend rustling around in his sleeping bag. We packed up slowly that morning. I was still thinking about what I felt during the night. I didn't bring it up right away. I kept replaying it in my head, wondering if it was just a weird dream or some leftover thought from a conversation we had the day before. While we were hiking later that morning, maybe a couple miles down the trail, I finally mentioned it. I said something like, I had this strange dream last night. Felt like something huge walked by our tent. I even imagined an elephant. My friend stopped walking for a second. I thought maybe he was going to laugh or make a joke, but he didn't. He looked over at me and said, "That's weird. I was awake last night for a while. Couldn't sleep. I didn't see anything, but I heard something big walk by." He didn't say much more after that. I didn't either. We just kept hiking. But my stomach felt weird, like the inside of me had gone a little cold. My friend isn't the type to make up stories. He's not dramatic or easily spooked. For him to admit he heard something large walking by our tent, completely unprompted, that stuck with me. We tried to rationalize it later, of course. Maybe it was a moose. They're big, they move kind of silently sometimes, and they do live up there. But even moose usually make more noise when they move through brush. And whatever this thing was, it didn't sound like it was bumbling or stepping through branches. The ground just kind of pulsed, once with each step, like the earth itself was reacting. And the steps stopped almost as suddenly as they started. No crunching, no water sounds near the stream. Just those few steps in silence. We never figured it out. There were no tracks near the tent the next morning, but the soil was hard-packed, not the kind that leaves prints easily. We hadn't put the rainfly on, so if something had looked in at us, we'd never know. It gives me this sick feeling when I think about that now. That whatever it was, it could have been standing just a few feet away, and we'd have no clue. No barrier, just some mesh between us and whatever was out there. That night changed how I camp. I still go, still hike and sleep in tents, but I always use a rain fly now. Doesn't matter what the weather says. I don't care if it's clear skies and no chance of rain. I need that layer. Not because it'll stop anything from getting in, but because it lets me sleep. It tricks my brain into thinking I'm safe. We didn't talk about that night much after the trip. Maybe once or twice when someone asked about creepy camping stories, but that was it. It didn't feel like something we could explain well enough for people to get it. No one believes you when you say you felt something. They want sounds, footprints, proof. But I remember what it felt like. The weight of those steps in the dirt. The way it passed by like it owned the place. Slow, steady, confident. Whatever it was didn't care that we were there. Didn't need to be loud. Just passed by in the dark and kept going. We'll never know what it was, but I know it was real.